Chapter 1505. After a round of congratulations, Luo Fan naturally got to know all the false saints present. He also understood which saint the false saints present belonged to. At this time, although it had been a long time since Hun Guzi and the others had invited the false saints who were also disciples of the saints, they still did not summon all the false saints over. This was because many false saints under the saints did not want to get involved in this matter and were only willing to wait quietly at the side. In fact, in other words, they were the false saints who were on the same side as Jing Yitzi and did not care much about whether this matter would succeed or not. To them, what they wanted to do the most was naturally to cultivate quietly and wait quietly. As for this battle that would decide the course of action between the two camps and unify the two camps, what did it have to do with them? How could they be willing to get involved in this mess? Therefore, they pretended not to receive the spiritual light emitted by Hun Guzi and the others. They did not come here directly like the false saints in this world. The reason why they did not proceed with their original plan of inviting the saints to create a battlefield that only the victors could leave was also because they wanted to invite them here. Although the false saints were in the middle of the two camps and did not care about the outcome of this battle, who could guarantee that they would not change their minds at any time? For the false saints who had mastered the true saint mystiques, there was no need for a lot of them. As long as there was one who stood against the winning side, the outcome of this battle would become meaningless. The false saints who had mastered the true saint mystiques were enough to make all the false saints under the saints unable to move. They would make the situation exactly the same as it was now. There was no difference at all. It was precisely because they knew this that the false saints present knew that the false saints were not in their two camps and had no conflict with either camp. However, it was impossible for them to carry out the battle that they had to before they arrived. Although their people seemed to be here, they were not. Actually, their minds, a large portion of them were transmitted through the spiritual light to communicate with the false saints who were unwilling to come here and persuade them to come. It had been said before that the will of the saints was extremely firm. It was almost impossible to change. This was the case for the false saints who stood in the opposing camp. Those don't express their opinions. The false saint, who did not show any inclination and did not care about the final outcome of the battle, was the same. They had already decided not to participate in this battle. It was easy to imagine how difficult it would be to make them change their minds and come here without entering this world. Therefore, even though there were so many pseudo-saints who had mastered true divine omniscient powers, and almost every pseudo-saint had mobilized their potential to invite them over, the progress was still rather slow. Not only had none of the false saints been summoned over, but battles between true saints had also begun to break out in various parts of the void and in the extremely wide range of the heavens and earths. It could be said that it would still take a long time before he could make any significant progress. After roughly understanding the current situation, Luo Fan sighed, knowing that he didn't need to be so anxious before. According to the current development of the situation, there were probably still a few years before the battle between the disciples of the saints would truly erupt. Based on the divine court heavenly cauldron's ability to accelerate time, he still had at least billions of trillions of years. With the accumulation of such time, even if he slowed down his speed by 10 times, it would still be more than enough for him to completely refine the divine court heavenly cauldron before the battle erupted. Of course, since he had already completed the refinement and completely shattered the divine court heavenly cauldron into his body, allowing his body to fuse with the complete great Tao and become inseparable from then on, allowing him to forever maintain the false saint omniscient powers and false saint powers. Naturally, there was no need for him to feel any regret. After sighing with emotion for a while, he began to put this matter to the back of his mind and began to carefully experience the changes that had occurred to him after completely fusing the divine court heavenly cauldron into his body. At this moment, his perception of everything in the world had undergone an earth-shattering change. Even the chaotic state outside the world seemed to have become much clearer in his eyes. The various mysteries contained in the chaotic state seemed to have been unveiled in front of him, revealing its truth. In the past, when he looked at the chaotic state, he could only feel a sense of grayness. He could only know that it contained endless principles, endless mysteries, and endless power, but he couldn't distinguish what principles, what mysteries, and what power it was. If he wanted to understand the mysteries of the chaotic state, he could only do so through probing, attacking, and changing the chaotic state. But now, when he looked at the chaotic state, it was as if the fog had disappeared, and he could already see the principles, mysteries, and power. However, it was a pity that even though he had already seen all those things, his understanding of those principles, mysteries, and power still hadn't improved at all. In fact, on the contrary, because he could see it clearly, it made him more aware of the complexity of some principles, the profoundness of those mysteries, and the wonder of those powers. He naturally understood in his heart that it was impossible for him to comprehend, understand, or control all of this at the moment. On the contrary, unknowingly, it made him feel indescribable decadence and despair. In a trance, he felt that he would never be able to fully comprehend it, and that he couldn't walk freely in it. This was like an ordinary person who saw a complete stranger and didn't know how strong or weak he was. It wasn't strange at all if you wanted to challenge him. You would even imagine what would happen if you won, and how long it would take for you to win. However, if you knew that this person could crush you with a finger, would you still have the thought of challenging him? Would you really have delusions that you could win? Would you even think about how you would win? In the past, Luo Fan looked at the chaotic state. It was like an ordinary person looking at a complete stranger. Even if he knew that the opponent might be much stronger than him, he wouldn't despair. He would imagine how he would defeat the opponent. He would imagine what he would gain after defeating the opponent, what kind of performance he would have. But now, after seeing the chaotic state clearly, he was like an ordinary person who could clearly see all the abilities of an immortal. It was as if he knew what an immortal could do under such circumstances. How could he still think that he could defeat the opponent? How could he not feel this inexplicable despair? Is this the chaotic state in the eyes of the fake sage? No wonder there aren't any false saints who spend their efforts to comprehend the chaotic state in order to turn the false into the real. Instead, they all have their eyes on the opportunity in this Earth universe. Luo Fan instantly had such a thought. With this thought in mind, a faint smile appeared on Luo Fan's face. Fortunately, I know the key. Otherwise, becoming a fake sage might have really cut off my path to becoming a sage. He felt an indescribable sense of relief. After completely integrating the pseudo-chaos spiritual treasure Heavenly Court cauldron into his body, although Luo Fan didn't have such an expectation, he had actually completed the process of a normal cultivator becoming a fake sage. He had raised his life essence to the essence of a sage, or rather, the essence of a fake sage, allowing him to truly become a fake sage. It was precisely because of this improvement that he obtained a perspective that he couldn't obtain when he obtained the supreme authority of a certain world. It allowed him to have an ability that he had never had before, allowing him to easily see the true chaotic state. If he hadn't been extremely firm on the path to becoming a true sage, the despair he felt when he saw the chaotic state at this moment would have been enough to scatter all his spirit and crush all his initiative. It would have planted in his heart the thought that the chaotic state was invincible and that it was impossible for him to walk freely in it. This thought might be extremely weak, but it was definitely fatal to the path to becoming a true sage. A true sage was a supreme existence that could walk freely in the chaotic state, come and go freely, and could open up a perfect world at will. How could such an existence leave any flaws in his heart? Although this subtle thought was subtle, it was already a flaw, and it was enough to make it impossible for him to become a true sage forever. With this thought in mind, Luo Fan looked around and saw the gazes of many fake sages. In an instant, he comprehended more things that he had never comprehended before. The indifference in the depths of the fake sage's eyes was not completely indifference to those who had yet to become fake sages, but indifference to everything. It was even indifference to themselves. This kind of indifference could only be born from the deepest despair. It was born from the despair of realizing that all their paths had been completely cut off. It was indifference to everything. After seeing the source of this indifference, Luo Fan finally let out a long sigh. He realized that he suddenly couldn't feel any respect for these fake sages. Instead, he only felt an inexplicable sympathy for them. These are just walking corpses. Those fake sages who want to fight with all their might and fuse all the pseudo-primordial chaos spiritual treasures to create a world in order to obtain the opportunity to turn the fake into the real have fused all their courage and determination to carry out their final struggle. As for those who oppose it, they are already in complete despair and have truly accepted the fact that they can't become true sages. They regard fake sages as their final destination. In his heart, he instantly redefined the nature of the two camps of over 80 fake sages in front of him. From this definition, he clearly agreed with those fake sages who were fighting with all their might. Towards those fake sages who had completely accepted their fate and felt that fake sages were their final destination, he clearly knew that they were right and wise. He knew his limits, but he did not agree with their mentality. This mentality might be correct, but it was not the mentality of true cultivation. Even if the probability of success was only 1 in a trillion, true cultivators had to spend billions of times more effort to pursue, search, and work hard. It was just like Tao validation and becoming a sage. Ordinary cultivators would succeed. What were the chances of becoming a true sage? It might not even be 1 in a trillion. However, in the endless world, how many cultivators had worked hard for the goal of Tao validation and becoming a sage? Since ancient times, how many cultivators had worked hard? All of their lives had been wasted on this path. All of them had been wasted on this path. For the final slim chance of success, they had exhausted all of their efforts, all of their energy, and even their entire lives. Now, these fake sages had clearly reached the final step and were countless steps ahead of the countless cultivators in the countless worlds and boundless world. However, they had put down their efforts at this moment and retreated at the final step. Even if there were thousands of reasons and tens of thousands of reasons, Luo Fan would never agree with this. Luo Fan sensed his inner thoughts, and an inexplicable smile appeared on his face. He finally understood why the war between the fake sages did not really have anything to do with him. No matter which side won or lost, it would not really affect him. However, he had only thought about it for a while and had already gotten involved. He was even standing directly in the battlefield between the sects of the sages. All of this was clearly because he had already agreed with the pursuit of those fake sages to turn the fake into the real. In his heart, he was already looking forward to them being able to turn the fake into the real. After understanding his inner thoughts, Luo Fan suddenly felt as if he had obtained something and comprehended something. This kind of gain and epiphany was extremely small, so small that it could not even be summarized in words. However, this small gain had already made him feel that his control over the true sage mystique seemed to have strengthened a lot. Vaguely, he actually felt that he seemed to be able to control the karma net that he had used to fight against Hun Guzi's true sage mystique and leave the battlefield of Hun Guzi's true sage mystique. With a thought, he raised his hand and waved lightly. In an instant, in the depths of the void, in a world that had turned into a flying sword, the treasure light that belonged to the true sage mystique that had been shining for a long time instantly faded. Next, a net of karma shot out of the world, and with a tremor it disappeared without a trace. At this moment, this flying sword had already surrounded dozens of worlds. Among them, there were more than 6 fake sages in each world. Similarly, There were also more than 6 pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures that could transcend the shackles of heaven and earth. These worlds and these fake sages had previously surrounded this flying sword but did not attack it. They had used their powerful power to suppress and deter the world, as if they wanted to use this method to force the fake sages in this world to do something. At this moment, the layers of true sage treasure light that had enveloped the surroundings suddenly disappeared completely. Following that, a strange net broke away from the world and stepped into the void, disappearing without a trace in the blink of an eye. This change instantly stunned the many worlds and even more fake sages among them. While they were stunned, the voice of the Genesis sage came from the flying sword. Fellow Taoists, the 2 true sage mystiques have disappeared. I hope that everyone can open the way. There was no frustration in this voice. It was still as calm as before, as if nothing had happened. After Luo Fan left this world, the time in this world had been adjusted by the Genesis sage and the others for billions of years. After such a long time, the Genesis sage and the other 19 sages had already conducted the most detailed research they could on the 2 true sage mystiques inside the major Kiliacosm. Although this kind of research did not yield much in essence, it was already the limit of what they could do. At this time, the 2 true sage mystiques had already become useless. Although they were extremely precious, they were no longer of much use to them. Under such circumstances, Luo Fan suddenly regained control of his karma net and recalled it, causing the other true sage mystique to gradually disappear due to the loss of its opponent. To the many fake sages, this was not too regretful, nor would they feel that they had suffered a loss. At this moment, the Genesis sage was not forcing himself to speak with such an attitude. It was not forcefully suppressing it with the temperament of a sage, but his true attitude and true thoughts. If it was an ordinary matter, the surrounding fake sages might have directly believed him and made way. However, it was clear that this was no longer a trivial matter. It was related to whether they could turn the false into the real, and whether they could continue on their path of cultivation that spanned billions of trillions of years. Even if they knew that there was a 99% chance that the Saint of Genesis was telling the truth, it was meaningless for them to continue surrounding the flying sword. However, they could not let go of the remaining 0.1% chance. At this moment, not only did they not make way, but they also began to display their might, activating the power of the many pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures. In an instant, countless rays of spiritual light pounced towards the flying sword. They wanted to directly destroy the flying sword. Or rather, the defense of this world. They wanted to force the Genesis sage to hand over what they were looking for. Facing such an attack, the Genesis sage and the other 19 fake sages who had already lost their pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures that could transcend the shackles of heaven and earth should have been unable to resist. However, after comprehending the 2 true divine theurgy for billions of years, although they did not comprehend what they wanted, they were still able to comprehend it. The key to turning the fake into the real was to turn the fake into the real, but there were also many gains. At this moment, facing the attacks of the many pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures, the power of the 19 fake sages communicated. Then, under the control of the Genesis sage, an inexplicable change occurred. During this change, all the power gathered into a ray of spiritual light and suddenly rushed out from the tip of the flying sword. It turned into a large net in the void and suddenly wrapped around it. Every time it came into contact with the spiritual light emitted by the pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures, a portion of it would naturally split up and fight with that ray of spiritual light. In this way, when this big net swept over, the spiritual light emitted by each pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure was entangled with a small net that was tangible but insubstantial, but powerful beyond imagination. Moreover, every small net seemed to be wholeheartedly controlled and commanded by a pseudo-saint. They actually gradually gained the upper hand when dealing with the spiritual light emitted by every pseudo-primordial chaos numinous treasure. From the looks of it, it seemed like it was gradually turning into a victory and wiping out all the spiritual lights. Seeing such a change, the fake sages who were besieging them were shocked. Such a method was already close to a true sage mystique. At this moment they did not dare to be negligent. They instantly activated the pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures and channeled their power into the spiritual lights they emitted, greatly increasing the power of the spiritual lights in the process. The power of the spiritual lights was also greatly supported. In the end, they slowly turned the tables. After an unknown period of time, they barely shattered the nets one by one, preventing the spiritual lights they emitted from being sealed by the net. It also prevented their pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures from being easily snatched away like a real true sage mystique. At this point, the fake sages heaved a sigh of relief. Fortunately, it's not a true sage mystique. Otherwise, I'm afraid we'll be in trouble this time. Every false saint had similar thoughts in their minds. However, at this moment, when they calmed down and took a look, they realized that the flying sword had already left their encirclement. It had already left a distance that they could not catch up to no matter how hard they chased after it. It was not because it was so far that they could not cross it, but because it was so far that they could not catch up with the speed of the flying sword with their speed. The fake sages watched the flying sword slowly escape from afar, and none of them spoke. Not to mention that they could not catch up to it now. Even if they could, they probably would not dare to chase after it again. Although the fake sages in the flying sword did not obtain the true sage mystique because they had comprehended the battle process of the two true sage mystiques, the mystique that they had comprehended from the two true sage mystiques, the mystique that could only be performed by the combined forces of the sages, had already surpassed the limit of the fake sage mystique. Even if it was not a true sage mystique, it was already not something that they could resist. It would be fine if they could not catch up to it. Even if they did, they would only be tortured. It was impossible for them to achieve what they wanted to achieve. Chapter 1506. Luo Fan naturally didn't care about what would happen to the Genesis Saint and the others after he summoned back the true Saint Divine ability. At this moment, he was in a world that was more powerful than any other world in the Earth's universe. He stretched out his hand and grabbed the net of karma that tore through space. This net of karma had an earth-shattering battle with Hunguzi's divine ability in the Great Thousand Worlds, and it was enough to completely destroy all pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures. But at this moment, it seemed so tame and gentle in Luo Fan's hands. It was like an ordinary silk net that changed shape at will in his hands. As expected, it can be controlled. Luo Fan looked at the net of karma in his hands and an inexplicable smile appeared on his face. Compared to when he had first released this karma net, although it didn't seem much different on the surface, it was many times stronger in essence. The various subtle and mysterious changes that were originally hidden were no longer concealed at this moment. They were all revealed without any reservation. Luo Fan carefully observed and could clearly see the countless changes of the true Saint Divine ability. If he wanted to master all the changes and evolutions of the true Divine Mystique, it might not be as easy as fusing the Divine Court Heavenly Cauldron into his body, and the time he needed to do so would not be any shorter than the time he needed to do so. If this true Saint Divine ability wasn't controlled by Luo Fan, it would naturally dissipate even if it had the ability to exist forever. It was just like the true Saint Divine ability that Hunguzi had previously released. But now that Luo Fan was controlling it, such a thing naturally wouldn't happen. Because it had a target for its existence, it could still act as if it was in the middle of a battle with a true divine remarkable ability. It would exist forever. It would only disappear when Luo Fan dispersed it, or when he no longer cared about this true divine mystic art. Luo Fan recalled his true Saint Divine ability. Although it was an extremely secretive action, it only took a flash and didn't even touch the space-time of this world, but the net of karma had already appeared in his hand. Under normal circumstances, no one would be able to notice how this web of karma appeared. Perhaps they would think that the karma web was created by Luo Fan's true divine power. However, it was clear that this was not a normal situation. All that existed in this world were false saints. Moreover, they were all false saints under the saints. Not only were they omnipotent, they had also mastered all kinds of true divine remarkable powers. How could anything that happened in this world be hidden from such existences? How could they not know the difference between using the true divine mystique and summoning it back? Therefore, all the false saints instantly knew what was going on. All of a sudden, all the false saints looked at Luo Fan as if he was a monster. Among them, the one who was the most moved was Hun Guzi. He looked at the net of karma in Luo Fan's hand and instantly knew where it came from. He also completely understood what Luo Fan had done. For a moment, the shock in his heart made him unable to maintain his composure. All of a sudden, his figure flashed and he appeared directly in front of Luo Fan. He stared at the net of karma in his hand and opened and closed his mouth a few times before saying, "You can actually summon back the true divine mystique in a battle state?" To a false saint, the barrier between time and space was meaningless. Although Hun Guzi did not speak very loudly, all the pseudo-sages heard him clearly. For a moment, the disbelief on everyone's faces turned into shock. Then, the shock on their faces quickly turned into wariness. They knew very well what it meant to be able to summon back the true divine mystique in a battle. This definitely meant that this person had already taken a step towards becoming a true divine. At the very least, he was one step closer than them. For the many false sages who had already given up hope of becoming true sages, it was obvious how great the impact was. When Luo Fan heard Hun Guzi's words, he laughed and said, "I suddenly had an epiphany, so I summoned it back. After all, it's not a good thing for them to keep pestering me." Hearing Luo Fan's confirmation, Hun Guzi could not help but gasp. So that's really the case. How can such a thing be done? Luo Fan naturally knew how much impact his actions had on them, so he no longer provoked them. With a raise of his hand, the net of karma was absorbed into his body and hidden in a certain space-time in his body. At this moment, his body had completely fused with the divine quartz heaven cauldron. Compared to before, the space-time in his body had naturally undergone earth-shattering changes. In the past, the endless space-time in his body was just a strange, small world. It could not even be considered a complete minor kiliacosm. However, at this moment, because of the divine quartz heaven cauldron's nature as a pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure, because of the great Tao hidden in it that was more powerful, more vast, and more complete than any great Tao that could give birth to a saint, the countless spaces had already grown into a true major kiliacosm. In other words, at this moment, the body of Luo Fan's incarnation already hid an endless major kiliacosm that almost surpassed the limit of numbers. Even if the number of these major kiliacosm could not compare to the endless major kiliacosm hidden in the void of Earth's universe, they were definitely on the same order of magnitude. Moreover, these major kiliacosm were the same as the real major kiliacosm. There were endless living beings, all kinds of strange civilizations, and even endless cultivators. However, compared to the major kiliacosm in the outside world, all living beings in it were projections, distortions, and divisions of Luo Fan's mind, will, and other things. This was different from the real major kiliacosm. This was the biggest change after Luo Fan's incarnation became a false sage. It was very natural for Luo Fan to include this karma net into one of the endless major kiliacosm. As for why Luo Fan did not dissipate this mystique and kept it instead, the reason was very simple. The true sage mystique contained endless mysteries and indeed had the potential to fight with all true sage mystiques until the end of time. However, the true sage mystique that had just been born was completely different from the true sage mystique that had been refined and had fought with the true sage mystique for an unknown amount of time. After being refined and deduced a large number of mysteries, the power of the true sage mystique was many times stronger than the true sage mystique that had just been born. If this kind of power was used to deal with the same true sage mystique, there would naturally not be any immediate effect. After all, the true sage mystique that it was used to deal with also had almost endless potential. Naturally, it could also evolve countless targeted responses to its attack. It could continuously stimulate its potential in the attack and finally block it. Thus, this true sage mystique would be like an ordinary true sage mystique that had just been cast and continue to fight with another true sage mystique until eternity. This obviously would not cause any essential change to the result. At most, it would only give this true sage mystique a little advantage. At the very beginning, however, it did not mean that the true divine theurgy was worthless even though it was useless against another true divine theurgy. In fact, if this true sage mystique was used to deal with other existences that were not true sage mystiques, its power could be countless times stronger than a new true sage mystique. For example, if Luo Fan were to use the true sage mystique to deal with hundreds of pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures, it might take a few days and nights. It might even take a few months to completely deal with them. However, if he were to use this true sage mystique that had been tempered and changed, he might be able to deal with those hundreds of pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures in an instant. The value of such a true sage mystique could be imagined. Naturally, Luo Fan could not let it go to waste just like that. Anyway, putting it away was just a piece of cake for him, and it was not a troublesome matter. After putting away the karma net, Luo Fan looked relaxed. At this moment, Jing Yitzi smiled and said, "I didn't expect you to have such an ability. I'm really sorry." "You flatter me, fellow Taoist." Luo Fan just smiled. This was not the time to be humble. "All right. I wonder if you have any insights? Can you share them with us?" Jing Yitzi said shamelessly. The eyes of the other pseudo-sages lit up slightly at this moment. Obviously, Jing Yitzi had asked the question that they wanted to ask but could not. At this moment, they were quite concerned about the answer that Luo Fan could give them. Hearing Jing Yitzi's words, Luo Fan smiled. Probably only Jing Yitzi could say such words so calmly. However, it was not that he did not feel offended. He smiled and said, "You're thinking too much. Even if I have gained something, it's extremely insignificant compared to your masters. If even your masters can't explain these things clearly, how can I do it?" When the pseudo-sages heard this, they came to a realization and the light in their eyes dimmed slightly. How could they be simple to be able to cultivate to their current realm? As for what Luo Fan said, he naturally knew that what Luo Fan said was correct. They naturally did not believe that their masters would hold back from them and not hide what they could teach them when teaching them. Under such circumstances, since their masters could not tell them the key to controlling the true divine mystique, it obviously meant that this key was not something that outsiders could teach them. In fact, it was impossible for it to be conveyed through any language or thought. "That's a pity," Jing Yitzi said with a smile. However, he did not look disappointed. Instead, he looked as calm as before. After saying this, he did not say anything else. Hun Guzi sighed in front of Luo Fan and said, "I didn't expect you to be able to do this. It seems that the chaos caused by the true divine mystique no longer has any effect on you." "Why do you say that, fellow Taoist? Although I can recall my true divine mystique, I can only recall mine. As for the battle between the other true divine mystiques, I can't do anything about it, nor can I change the outcome," Luo Fan said with a smile. Hun Guzi shook his head and said, "Even so, the true divine mystique in your hands is no different from the false divine mystique. Compared to us, this is already a qualitative improvement and far surpasses us." Luo Fan only shook his head and smiled. He did not say anything else. Seeing that Luo Fan did not speak, Hun Guzi continued, I wonder what fellow Taoist thinks of this battle? This is a battle between fellow Taoists. How can I have any opinion? Luo Fan said with a smile. Hun Guzi did not beat around the bush and asked directly, Fellow Taoist, do you plan to stand on our side or the enemy's side? When Luo Fan heard this, he raised his eyes and swept his gaze across the world. He instantly saw the expressions of the sages present. At this moment, hearing Hun Guzi's words, the expressions of the sages present changed subtly. Obviously, all three sides were very concerned about Luo Fan's answer. Of course, among the three sides, two of them hoped that Luo Fan would join their side. As for the remaining side represented by Jing Yizhi, their mentality was completely different. They did not expect Luo Fan to join their side, but they were only curious about which side Luo Fan wanted to join. Looking at the expressions of the sages, Luo Fan finally said, Since I must join, then I will join fellow Taoist's side. Hearing this, the expressions of the sages changed. The expressions of the false sages on Teacher Feng's side turned rather ugly. As for Hun Guzi's side, their expressions all became joyful. In particular, Hun Guzi laughed out loud, completely losing the calmness and composure that he had as a false sage. From this, it could be seen how happy he was about Luo Fan joining his side. After laughing for a while, he said to Luo Fan, Fellow Taoist, your choice is definitely correct. When Lu Fuan heard this, he only smiled and did not say anything. Everyone would definitely feel that their position was correct. They would definitely feel that the side they joined was correct. Even the false sages were no exception to this. Therefore, Hun Guzi's words did not make any sense at all. Luo Fan directly expressed that he would join Hun Guzi's side. He would help Hun Guzi and the others fuse the many pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures to create a truly vast world. Apart from agreeing with their thoughts, more importantly, he had to do this. He himself had the true sage mystique and could easily make the outcome of the battle between the two sides meaningless. Obviously, he was already in existence that many false sages couldn't leave him alone and allow him to leave the battlefield freely. Now that he could control the true sage mystique in battle, this obviously became more dangerous and had a greater impact on the outcome of the battle. Under such circumstances, if he wanted to be an invisible person like before, not joining any side and just watching from the sidelines, then no matter what the outcome of the battle was, no matter which side won, he would fall into the same fate as the loser. He would be trapped in the battlefield and unable to leave. Even if his body had completely fused with the divine court heaven cauldron and the great Tao within it could no longer be taken away, his situation would still be extremely dangerous. It was even possible that he would be besieged by many false sages in the end, shattering his body and extracting the great Tao fragments within it. Under such circumstances, the only chance for him to obtain freedom and not fall into the same fate as the loser was to join one of the sides and help that side win. Only in this way could he leave the battlefield with the victors and not be deprived of his freedom. Therefore, the real reason why he made this choice was not because he was willing, but because he had no other choice. After Hun Guzi finished laughing, the false sages on their side looked at him in a completely different way. There was no longer a faint estrangement, but they completely treated him as one of their own. Hun Guzi didn't stay here. After confirming that Luo Fan would join their side, he turned around and left Luo Fan's continent. He directly returned to his own continent and stopped in the same posture as before. Luo Fan had long understood the situation of the two sides very well. Which false sages were on this side, which false sages were on that side, and which sages were under them. All of this was no longer a secret to Luo Fan. This way, there was naturally no need for Hun Guzi to waste his breath to explain to him. Luo Fan knew this very well, and so did Hun Guzi. That was why Hun Guzi immediately turned around and left after inviting Luo Fan to join his side. Since he had already joined his side, Luo Fan's mentality naturally changed slightly. He looked at the many false sages again, but he no longer had the same indifferent thoughts as before. Instead, he began to analyze the situation of these false sages in detail. He analyzed the Tao they cultivated and the method they used to maintain their false sage status after leaving the world. From this, he simulated how he should fight them if he were to face them. If he did this again, the others would do the same. Moreover, most of them targeted him, analyzing what they should do if they were to face him, and thinking about how they should cooperate with him. Using true sage mystical abilities to fight seemed like they did not have to care about it. However, this did not mean that there was no technique in this kind of battle. There was no need to plan. In fact, this kind of true sage mystical ability was equivalent to a pistol to an ordinary person to these false sages. After an ordinary person fired a shot, it was impossible for them to control the bullet. They could only watch the result of this shot happen. Did this mean that ordinary people did not need techniques to fight with guns? No need to plan? Because of such a change, the atmosphere among the true sages had already undergone a huge change. The entire world was no longer as relaxed as before. The false sages also stopped what they were doing and relaxed activities. Although their expressions were calm, the light of wisdom in their eyes was constantly flickering. During this process, time gradually passed. Unknowingly, several years had passed. In these few years outside this world, the war between the various worlds had already stopped. However, from time to time there would be collisions between true sage mystical abilities somewhere. They began to emit layers of endless treasure light, illuminating the surrounding area of nothingness. It also made the various worlds seem to be shrouded by spots of light, becoming mottled. And after this battle, some false sages would sense something and once again emit rays of spiritual light to leave this world. Or some false sages would cross the sky and come over. They would appear in this world, allowing this world to grow again. They would also settle down in this world. This kind of thing happened quite frequently. 3 years later, the number of false sages in this world, including Luo Fans, had already exceeded 100, reaching 123 clearly. During this time, there were already more than 30 false sages who were originally stubborn and did not intend to come but were persuaded to come to this world. They were waiting for the battlefield to take shape, for the dispute to be resolved, and for the battle to unify their opinions to begin. As for why they came obediently, it was even more simple. In the past 3 years, the battle between the true sages' mystical abilities had broken out everywhere. At this time, the spots of light that appeared in the void gave the most detailed explanation for their reasons. On this day, Luo Fan asked Hun Guzi, "How many fellow Taoists are still unwilling to come?" Although Hun Guzi was not the false sage with the highest status here, he was the one who organized it after all. Later on, he also had the responsibility of begging the sage supremes to open up the battlefield, so he could barely be considered the person in charge. Of course, he should be the one to handle all these things. Hearing Luo Fan's words, Hun Guzi said helplessly, "There's also this last person. He should be considered your peer." Peer? Luo Fan was curious. Seriously speaking, all the false sages here were also disciples of the sages. They were all senior brothers and junior sisters. There was no such thing as seniority. However, after all, the age difference between the many false sages was extremely huge. The time difference between them being disciples of the sages might be billions of years. Naturally, it was impossible for them to be completely equal. Under such circumstances, the issue of seniority naturally arose. At this moment, in this world, many false sages were divided into more than 10 generations based on the era in which they had left the Earth universe and entered the universe. The oldest one was a false sage under the Heavenly Lord of primordial beginning, who had cultivated to become a false sage in the universe 300 trillion years ago. The most recent one was a false sage under the primordial chaos ancestor, who had become a false sage more than 80 million years ago. In this way, the seniority of all the false sages in this world was obviously higher than Luo Fan, who had just become a false sage not long ago. Chapter 1507. I wonder which saint is under that fake saint and who he is? Luo Fan asked curiously. 23 Us. He is a disciple of the exalted Saint Amitabha, and his name is Jin Chanzi. Fellow Taoist may not have met this person, but you should be quite familiar with his senior brother. Hun Guzi sighed. Golden Cicada. Amitabha's disciple. Could it be that his senior brother is fellow Taoist Shin Chan? Luo Fan thought for a moment and found a name from the depths of his memory. He could not help but exclaim. Although he did not know who Golden Zen Master was and had never seen him before, he had only seen one disciple of the Amitabha Buddha, and that was Golden Zen Master. Under such circumstances, when Hun Guzi said that Golden Zen Master's senior brother was someone he was familiar with, the first person he could think of was Divine Zen Master. Moreover, young Zen Master Shun and young Zen Master Jin had similar names, so it was highly possible that they were fellow disciples. Exactly. Hun Guzi sighed. He's fellow Taoist Shin Chan's junior brother. How is this possible? Fellow Taoist God Zen Master was only a level 3 pseudo-sage several million years ago. Before Luo Fan could finish, he shut his mouth. He originally wanted to say that since Jin Chan was God Zen Master's junior brother, then his cultivation level should be similar to God Zen Master's. Even if it was higher, it wouldn't be by much. Under such circumstances, only a few million years had passed. How could he obtain such a huge breakthrough so quickly and become a false sage? However, before he could finish his words, he realized that he was mistaken. Time was of the essence to a false saint. Although it wasn't like the existence of space or other things that sages could control and change as they pleased. But it wasn't something that was too difficult. If Golden Zen Master wanted to, he could even treat these millions of years as billions of trillions of years. In terms of the length of time, this was clearly not a valid reason. Hun Guzi obviously knew what Luo Fan was thinking and understood that Luo Fan already knew that he was wrong. He didn't explain further and just said, "Now, only fellow Taoist Jin Chanzi is left." I see. How is the progress now? Is there any hope for fellow Taoist Jin Chanzi to come? Luo Fan asked. There isn't much progress. Fellow Taoist Golden Zen's Tao heart is firm. Unshakable. Now, nearly every fellow Taoist has gone to invite him over, but he doesn't seem to care. Hun Guzi sighed. Upon hearing that, Luo Fan sighed. His Tao heart was firm. This was clearly implying that he was stubborn. Then what do you plan to do? Are we just going to let him go? Luo Fan asked. It's naturally impossible for him to go. If that was the case, I'm afraid the other fellow Taoists will disperse. Hun Guzi said. Since all of the fellow Taoists have already been there, there's nothing we can do. What else can we do now? I would like to invite fellow Taoists to make a trip there. Me? Luo Fan couldn't help but feel a little incredulous. Fellow Taoists, if you can't do it, how can I possibly succeed? Fellow Taoists, your friendship with him is even deeper than mine. Hun Guzi wore a helpless expression and said, It's precisely because of our deep friendship that it's troublesome. Moreover, just because we can't do it doesn't mean that fellow Taoists can't. Fellow Taoists' grasp of a true divine's divine ability is above ours, so you won't have to worry about anything and will have a greater chance of inviting him over than us. Upon hearing this, although Luo Fan still felt that it was unreliable, he didn't refuse. Since so many people had gone, it wasn't a big deal for him to make a trip there. Thus he nodded and said, Then I'll make a trip. Thank you, fellow Taoist. Hun Guzi was overjoyed. It's hard to say whether I'll succeed or not. Luo Fan smiled faintly. Hun Guzi said, It's already a great honor for fellow Taoists to be willing to make a trip, so how can I not thank you? Let me lead the way with fellow Taoists. Please. Luo Fan nodded. Hun Guzi smiled faintly, and a ray of spiritual light appeared on his body. It tore through this world and shot towards the depths of the void outside. Without any hesitation, Luo Fan raised his hand and pointed. A net of karma suddenly appeared between the boundless worlds in his body. His body swayed slightly and disappeared from this world in the blink of an eye along with the ray of spiritual light. At this moment, Luo Fan's consciousness was already attached to the net of karma. However, his body in this world had its eyes closed and was like a statue, as if it had turned into a dead object. Of course, this was only on the surface. After all, this clone of Luo Fan had already become a false sage. Even if he split a bit of his consciousness away, his body wouldn't turn into a dead object. Instead, it wouldn't be much different from before. He could still display his full strength and could still react to the slightest changes in the outside world. However, he wouldn't be in any danger just because his consciousness was away. The reason why his eyes were closed and he looked like a dead object was because Luo Fan wasn't paying attention to this. The world that Jin Chanzi was in was a fixed world in the void. It wasn't difficult for a false sage to reach such a fixed world. Almost in the blink of an eye, Luo Fan's net of karma had already followed the ray of spiritual light that Hun Guzi had shot through the void and arrived outside this world. Outside this world, there were already 2 true sage Theurgis engaged in an extremely intense battle. The layers of treasure light that erupted from the battle had already annihilated the hundreds of millions of great thousand worlds in the surroundings, causing the surroundings to become an empty area with only the treasure light and the 2 true divine remarkable abilities. In this area, the changes that the 2 true sage Theurgis were producing were extremely profound and unimaginably complicated. Even though Luo Fan was already a true false sage and had also mastered a true sage Theurgy, he couldn't help but feel inexplicably shocked as he watched the battle between the 2 true sage Theurgis. He felt that the changes of the true sage Theurgis were profound and unfathomable. In the battlefield of the true sage Theurgis, the world that looked like a painting floated quietly. The treasure light of the true sage Theurgis didn't affect this world at all. The aftermath of the battle between the 2 true sage Theurgis didn't treat this world as an external force and didn't cause any damage to this world. At this moment, Hun Guzi's spiritual light condensed and turned into his figure outside the painting in the blink of an eye. Compared to Hun Guzi's real body, this figure was of course hundreds of millions of times weaker. However, it still contained a bit of the aura of the true sage Theurgis, and its power was also quite strong. At least, it wasn't something that a supreme supremacy could compare to. In fact, it could even use its own destruction as the price to release a true sage Theurgis. Among the 2 true sage Theurgis that were fighting outside this world, one of them was released by the other false sage at the price of his spiritual light. I didn't expect another newcomer to come. At this moment, a clear voice came from that world. When Luo Fan heard this voice, he instantly knew that it must be Jin Chanzi's voice. His heart stirred. His net of karma instantly froze. It also turned into his figure. The true sage Theurgis were very profound. They had endless changes and even exceeded the limits of what a false sage could understand. They turned this Theurgis into their own incarnation. What was so difficult about that? It seems that the new Taoist has already prepared for battle, Jin Chanzi said in a mocking tone. So many Taoists have already said what should be said before. No matter how much they say, it will just be a rehash of the old and it won't change the result. In that case, why do we need to say more? Since Taoist isn't willing to join us now, I'll destroy this world, Luo Fan said faintly. Hun Guzi was shocked at first when he heard this. Then, a look of realization appeared on his face. Destroy this world? Does that mean that Taoist doesn't plan to care about the survival of the universe? Jean Chanzy paused for a moment before he continued. As he spoke, the figure of a man gradually appeared on the surface of the painting. This man was extremely handsome, and his entire body was filled with an ethereal charm. The unfathomable wisdom in his eyes was so strong that it was shocking. He looked more masculine than any sage that Luo Fan had seen in the past. When he saw this person, Luo Fan immediately knew that he was Jean Chanzy. At this moment, Jean Chanzy looked at Luo Fan with an extremely strange expression. Suddenly, he came to a realization and said, "So it's you. I originally thought that cultivating to this stage during this period of time was already extremely fast. I didn't expect that you would also reach this stage so quickly. You know me?" Luo Fan frowned. "Not really. I've only heard about you from my senior brother. However, it doesn't matter. This place has already become the domain of two true divine remarkable powers. If you use your true divine remarkable powers, it will form an unstoppable vicious cycle with the two true divine remarkable powers. The scale of the cycle will continue to expand until it completely envelopes the universe and destroys it. I don't think you can bear the consequences. You should go back," Jean Chanzy said faintly. His expression was that he had everything under control. "So that's what you're thinking. In that case, let's give it a try," Luo Fan said with a smile. With a thought, the body that formed his current body instantly exploded. Then, the karma net that formed this body reappeared, and the incomparably powerful true divine aura surged wildly. At this moment, the two true divine mystiques that were originally fighting were stimulated by the aura of the true divine mystique. Their power suddenly increased and boundless power instantly pounced towards the karma net. It seemed that the karma net was about to be completely sucked into it, and from then on, it would form an almost irreversible vicious cycle of destruction. Luo Fan's straightforwardness caused Jean Chanzy to reveal an expression of disbelief. He looked at Luo Fan as if he was looking at a madman. The deep and unfathomable wisdom in his eyes suddenly became a little chaotic at this moment. As a false sage, it was almost instinctive for him to consider the pros and cons. He believed that any false sage would know what would happen when three true sage mystical abilities came into contact with each other. This was also where his original confidence came from. As long as the two true sage mystical abilities outside this world continued to fight here, no matter how many false sages came here, they would not be able to do anything to him. No matter how many false saints forced him, he could act according to his own thoughts. Even when Luo Fan said that he wanted to use the true divine remarkable powers to destroy the world he was in, he only thought that Luo Fan was not used to negotiating with false saints and was just using a childish threat. He would never really do that. He would never really destroy the entire world just to force him to go with him. However, what happened at this moment completely subverted his thoughts and ideas. Is this really a false saint? How can he destroy the entire world just for such a small matter? In an instant, countless thoughts appeared in Jean Chanzy's mind. Just as he was thinking about this, Luo Fan had already controlled his true divine remarkable powers and blasted it towards the world. It directly resisted the pursuit of the two true divine remarkable powers behind him and blasted it towards the world. In an instant, countless spiritual lights were formed. Countless explosions caused the world to tremble crazily, causing the laws of the world in the world to tremble violently. Even the great Tao in the unseen world began to tremble violently. It looked like it was about to be destroyed. The greatest characteristic of the true divine remarkable powers was that they were completely targeted at the target. Endless transformations. This change caused any existence that did not have such changes, be it the false saint, the world, or the false divine remarkable powers. They were all incomparably fragile in front of it. Just like at this moment, when this karma net first came into contact with it, it could not shake the world at all. However, with just a slight change, it had already naturally found the weakness of the world and easily attacked this weakness, causing the world to be filled with countless cracks. At this moment, the only thing Jean Chanzi could do was use the true divine remarkable powers to resist Luo Fan's karma net. Only by doing this would he be able to stop the changes in the karma web. Only then would he be able to protect the world he resided in under the karma web. However, if he used a true divine theurgy to block the karma web, it would affect and stimulate the other true divine theurgy. In the end, it would cause the destructive power to explode and destroy the heaven and earth. This was obviously in conflict with the purpose of using the true divine remarkable powers. In an instant, countless thoughts flashed through Jean Chanzi's mind. He understood the pros and cons of this. He forcibly suppressed the urge to use the true divine remarkable powers. In an instant, he raised his eyes and glanced at Hun Guzi. There was no despair on Hun Guzi's face. He knew that the current situation was not as hopeless as he had imagined. There should still be a chance to salvage the situation. And the one who could salvage the situation, it was obviously the false saint who was using the true divine remarkable powers to attack the world he was in. Feeling helpless, he could only forcefully swallow the depression in his heart and say, "Stop. I'll go with you." Hearing this, Luo Fan suddenly stopped the karma net and completely stopped the destruction of the world. He said, "Is what fellow Taoist said true? If I'm lying, how much time would it take for fellow Taoists to do it again?" Jean Chanzi smiled bitterly. At this moment, the two true divine remarkable powers that were fighting had already swept into the karma net. The three true divine remarkable powers were already entangled in one place, and the aftermath of the battle had already begun to expand crazily. Seeing this scene, Jean Chanzi was inwardly nervous. "That's true." Luo Fan's voice came from the karma net. His voice was still calm, as if the battle between the three true divine remarkable powers that were causing the destruction of the various worlds had not occurred. Just as he said these words, the karma net trembled slightly. Suddenly, all of its power converged and transformed into Luo Fan's body. In an originally impossible situation, Luo Fan had escaped from the battle circle. As the karma net left the battle circle, the two true divine remarkable powers that were originally fighting lost the effect of external forces and fell back into a state of equilibrium. The aftermath of the battle no longer spread, maintaining the scale that had already expanded and gradually began to stabilize. You can actually control the true divine remarkable powers that enter a state of battle. Jean Chanzi looked at Luo Fan and exclaimed. At this moment, he no longer had the unfathomable calmness and indifference of a false saint. However, he was like an ordinary cultivator who saw something that he could not understand at all. Although he was of the same generation as Luo Fan, he had just become a false saint not long ago. However, as a disciple of a sage who had mastered the true divine remarkable powers, after seeing the result of the battle between the true divine remarkable powers, how could he not understand how difficult it was to control the true divine remarkable powers when they entered a state of battle? At this moment, seeing an existence who was not a true divine remarkable powers do this, it felt as ridiculous as seeing an ant tripping an elephant. At this moment, how could he not know why Luo Fan had acted so tough previously and why he had sent the true divine remarkable powers to the world where he was and wanted to destroy it? All of this was because he had enough confidence that his actions wouldn't completely destroy all the worlds in the universe. "I'm sorry for the embarrassment." Luo Fan smiled faintly. He said, "It seems that I didn't lose unjustly." Jean Chanzi sighed. "Haha, since fellow Taoist has agreed, let's set off. Fellow Taoists must be waiting anxiously now." Hun Guzi laughed when he saw this. After waiting for so many years, after waiting for so long, finally Jean Chanzi agreed to go to the battlefield. How could Hun Guzi not be excited? Jean Chanzi sighed and did not say anything else. His figure disappeared from the painting. Then, a magic treasure, a pseudo-primordial origin spirit treasure, flew out from the painting. It rotated slowly in the void. This pseudo-primordial spiritual treasure looked like a monk's staff. It emitted an eternal and indestructible aura. It was also a pseudo-primordial spiritual treasure that had transcended the shackles of heaven and earth. Then, a figure slowly appeared under the pseudo-primordial spiritual treasure. This was Jean Chanzy. As he appeared, the pseudo-primordial spiritual treasure naturally emitted traces of the great Tao and communicated with Jean Chanzy's body. This caused Jean Chanzy's realm to not regress and his status to remain at the false sage realm. This should be the characteristic of a false sage treasure refined by a sage. Luo Fan looked at the pseudo-primordial spiritual treasure above Jean Chanzy's head and thought to himself, among the false sages under the sages, although there were many ways for them to maintain their false sage status outside of heaven and earth and still have the characteristics of omnipotence, omniscience, eternity, and indestructibility, most of them were like Jean Chanzy at this moment. They used the great Tao hanging down from the treasure to communicate with themselves, thus maintaining their status through some mysterious method. In particular, those who stood in the third camp, that was, they did not agree or object to condensing many pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures into heaven and earth. Almost all of them used this method. This made Luo Fan suspect that this might not be because they used the same method, but because the pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures they possessed had such characteristics. When he thought about it again, their pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures were not refined by themselves. Instead, they were specially refined by the sages according to their own cultivation path, their physique, their mentality, and so on. This was obviously the conclusion he came to. However, he naturally could not say too much about this. This was prying into their cultivation secret. Unless they took the initiative to say it, it would not be appropriate for others to ask too much. Jean Chanzy sighed and turned to look at the world behind him. "Let's go." As he spoke, he took a step forward and disappeared into nothingness. As soon as Luo Fan saw the look on his face, he knew that there must be some creature or item out there that was very important to Jean Chanzy. That was why he was so stubborn, unwilling to leave the world, and unwilling to go to the battlefield. Thinking of this, he could not help but be speechless. He sighed to himself and did not say anything else. His figure flickered and turned into a karma net again. With a slight rush, he had already disappeared into the void. In the blink of an eye, he had already arrived at the world where the hundreds of false sages under the sages were. He once again fell into the hands of his incarnation and was directly stored into the boundless vast thousand world within his body. At this moment, Jean Chanzy was already in this world. Chapter 1508. At this moment, Jean Chanzy's expression was calm. He looked no different from all the other false saints in this world. It was as if he was also a false saint who had arrived as soon as he was invited. It was impossible to tell that he was the one who had delayed everyone for so long. The pseudo-sages did not complain about the arrival of Jean Chanzy. On the contrary, they greeted him one by one as if he was also a very ordinary pseudo-sage. This caused this part of the world to become peaceful at this moment. Luo Fan and Hun Guzi had not sent out their true bodies to invite Jean Chanzy to come. It was just a ray of spiritual light and a true saint mystique. When Jean Chanzy arrived, they naturally opened their eyes at the same time and entered Jean Chanzy's sight at the same time. However, there was no need for Jean Chanzy to wait for them. After discovering Jean Chanzy's arrival, Hun Guzi did not hesitate and a faint light began to emit from his body. These rays of light were fine and dense, and each seemed to be real. They had an unimaginable existence, causing many false saints in this world to instantly focus their attention on them. After these rays of light appeared, they naturally produced all kinds of inexplicable and mysterious waves. Vaguely, there was a charm that was more advanced than that of a false saint being emitted from the rays of light. This kind of charm was something that many false sages could not understand. However, every false sage was different. Even Luo Fan knew clearly that this was a charm that was extremely closely related to a true saint. I see. This is how I contact a true saint. Luo Fan looked at these rays of light and instantly understood. When he understood this, Luo Fan could not help but feel a little enlightened and a little disappointed. He came to a realization and naturally felt that it was normal to contact a true saint like this. After all, a true saint came from a realm that he could not understand at all and appeared in a situation that he could not understand at all. However, it was very normal. As for feeling disappointed, it was even simpler. He had originally hoped that he could see some of the mysteries of a true saint through the process of Hun Guzi contacting a true saint. Now, it seemed that it was obviously impossible. How could he not be disappointed? The rays of light around Hun Guzi's body continued to spread and grow. After traveling for an unknown number of tens of thousands of miles, suddenly, he entered an unbelievable place and completely disappeared from the perception of any false sage. Even if these false saints could already see the primal chaos clearly, even if they could grasp all principles, all the mysteries of the world, and even the great Tao of the world, they still couldn't find where the light had gone. He has indeed communicated with the sages. Luo Fan thought to himself. The feeling that the sage was unfathomable was once again deepened in his heart. As the light drilled into a certain place, an effect that blocked the vision and perception of many false sages was produced on this light. Gradually, many false sages saw it. Hun Guzi's figure was gradually concealed and disappeared from their sight. All they could see was a ball of light that was growing brighter and more dazzling where Hun Guzi used to be. At the same time, the mysterious undulations seemed to have completely disappeared. They could no longer detect it. How could the false sages not know about such a situation? Right now, Hun Guzi had already contacted his master, the venerable primordial chaos ancestor. For a moment, all of them had solemn expressions. This communication lasted for an unknown period of time. In a daze, time seemed to have lost its meaning in this world. When everyone came back to their senses, they realized that the light had already dissipated and Hun Guzi's figure appeared again. How long has it been just now? Luo Fan was horrified, but he realized that he could not know how much time had passed just now. Was it an instant, a breath, a day, a year, or even 100 years, 1,000 years, 10,000 years? He looked at the expressions of the other false sages and realized that they were not surprised at all. It was as if everything was so natural. Luo Fan guessed to himself, could it be that they can clearly sense the passage of time? However, very quickly, he overthrew this conjecture. Impossible. I can't even sense it. If they aren't smarter than me, how could they sense it? Since they can't sense the passage of time, there's only one possibility. They're already used to this feeling. This must be the feeling that comes from communicating with a true sage. At the thought of this, Luo Fan could not help but gasp. He once again had a direct understanding of the power of a true sage. Fortunately, Master has agreed. Fellow Taoists, please be prepared. Hun Guzi seemed to have expended a lot of energy. At this moment, his face was a little pale, and the false sage aura on his body that was originally well restrained was now a little difficult to restrain. It began to spread out, gradually enveloping the world in an eternal and indestructible aura. When the false sages heard this, although their expressions did not change, Luo Fan could see from their eyes that they had relaxed. Although they felt that it was impossible for the venerable sage to reject their request, they were making a request to the Supreme Sage that they could not understand at all. Before the result was completely confirmed, anything could happen. At this moment, a mysterious change appeared in this world out of nowhere. In an instant, be it the great Tao, nomological laws, time, space, or everything else, everything in this world began to change at the same time. This change was so natural, but it was also so mysterious and profound. Even though Luo Fan could clearly sense all the changes, he could not understand the meaning of these changes at all. He could not deduce what the final result of these changes would be. However, although he could not sense the meaning of these changes, Luo Fan knew very well. This was the method of the primordial chaos ancestor. Knowing this, how would he dare to be negligent? Even if it was impossible for him to understand or comprehend it. However, he did not let go of any changes. He tried his best to remember them in his heart and tried his best not to miss anything. At the same time, he realized that his sense of time had disappeared again. When everything calmed down, when the world had completely changed, he realized that he had completely forgotten how long the process of the world changing had lasted. In the end, it was an extremely short moment. Or was it an endless billions of years? Upon realizing this, Luo Fan could not help but smile bitterly. Initially, he thought that he was already stronger than all the false sages and he already had some pride in his heart. However, now that he had encountered the means of a true sage, saint, he realized that he was so weak, almost like an ant. His pride had been completely shattered. I'm still too far away from a true saint. With this thought in mind, he completely suppressed all these thoughts at the bottom of his heart. With a thought, he began to observe the world that had been changed. At first glance, this world did not seem to be much different from before. It was still the same 100-over continent. It was also the same 100-over starry skies, 100-over seas, and even the stability of space-time. The complexity of the nomological law layer and the vastness of the great Tao were similar to before. However, with Luo Fan's eyesight, he could easily sense that this world was already worlds apart from before. This difference was so obscure, yet so mysterious. Even though Luo Fan could sense the existence of some kind of difference. However, he could not really explain it clearly. Is this the battlefield? Luo Fan looked at the world and his heart skipped a beat. He raised his hand and pointed. In an instant, his karma net had already drilled out of his body. With a tremble in the void, it completely destroyed the spacetime and even the nomological law layer within a radius of 10,000 miles. In fact, it even destroyed a part of the great Tao that corresponded to this place. Everything looked exactly the same as when a true saint's mystical ability was used normally. However, Luo Fan's pupils could not help but constrict. This was because he could clearly feel that this world naturally produced some kind of inexplicable restraining force that naturally limited the destruction to a certain range. The trend of spreading outward was completely cut off. I see. In that case, when the true saint's mystical abilities battle, they will be relatively independent, and the fluctuations of the battle will not expand infinitely. Such a battlefield is the most suitable for false saints with true saint mystical abilities, Luo Fan thought to himself. Just as Luo Fan was experimenting with the restraining effect of this world on true saint mystical abilities, the other false saints were also doing similar things. Naturally, it was impossible for them to not trust the saints. As disciples of the saints, they were very clear about the power of the saints, so how could they not trust them? The reason why they were doing this now was because they wanted to grasp the characteristics of this world after the change. They wanted to know what the effect of their true saint mystical abilities was in this world. They were all false saints, so their research ability was naturally not inferior to anyone else. Very soon, everyone had studied it clearly and retracted their false saint mystical abilities. At this moment, Hun Guzi raised his hand and pointed at the void. In an instant, the great Tao that was originally hidden in the void suddenly appeared. Then, he said, "Fellow Taoists, please choose your side." As soon as he said that, the expressions of the false saints changed slightly. Then, they each released a ray of spiritual light and rushed towards the great Tao that had appeared. This beam of divine light contained their standpoint, contained their choice. The moment the great Tao received the spiritual light, it suddenly shook and revealed figures one by one. 3 groups appeared on the great Tao. This was obviously a sign of the choices of the false saints. The choices of these false saints might have only been in their hearts, but once they engraved their choices in the great Tao, it became an irreversible choice. It eliminated the possibility of them making a fake choice. Looks like there's going to be some trouble. Luo Fan looked at the three camps that appeared on the great Tao and could not help but smile bitterly. Among the three camps, he could clearly see that Jean Chanzi, who was supposed to be in the center camp and was impartial, neither agreeing nor opposing, was now in the opposite camp. In other words, he was standing opposite Luo Fan. He suddenly changed his standpoint, just like that. Obviously, there was only one reason, and that was the incident where he was forcefully invited over. And because of this incident, he did this. Of course, it was because he hated Luo Fan and wanted to use this battle to teach him a lesson. Is there a need for that? Is there a need for a false saint to change his standpoint for such a small matter? Luo Fan felt helpless. When every pseudo-sage confirmed their camp, the great Tao gradually disappeared in the unseen world again, completely disappearing in front of everyone. There were 43 false saints on the side chosen by Luo Fan, 40 on the other side, and the rest were neutral. It seemed that this side had the upper hand, since both sides had been confirmed. Naturally, there was no need to talk nonsense. Immediately, the false saints who chose to be neutral turned around. They entered the darkness and began to protect the great Tao of heaven and earth to prevent the great Tao from being damaged too much during their battle. Although true saints had changed this part of the world, however, it only allowed this world to have the characteristics of a battle between true saints' mystical abilities, but it did not allow the entire world to be completely destroyed. However, it was impossible to completely prevent this world from being damaged because of their battle. That way, they would need to waste the power of a true saint to protect the great Tao of heaven and earth. How could a true saint do that for them? As the neutral false saints entered the darkness and protected the great Tao of heaven and earth, the battle in the world instantly erupted. Luo Fan, who had long known that Jean Chanzi would target him, directly summoned his karma net to block in front of him. At this moment, just as he had expected, Jean Chanzi's true saint mystical ability, a mystical ability that looked like a brush, appeared in front of him. It slashed down on the karma net. At the same time, in other places, many false saints also began to fight. The true saint mystical abilities began to erupt like rain. Boundless treasure lights were emitted from all over the place, stacking up and stacking up, causing the entire area to look as though it was made up of treasure lights. The aura of a true sage continued to spread out, breaking through the entire area. It engulfed a larger and larger area of nothingness, enveloping more and more major kiliacosms. More and more worlds had false saints. Under the layers of treasure light, these major kiliacosms and worlds could clearly feel that the world they were in seemed to have become a fallen leaf floating on the surface of a stormy sea. It seemed like it could be destroyed at any time, perish at any time, and be doomed to eternal damnation at any time. At such a moment, those false saints who were waiting for the situation to develop and had temporarily stopped the war were already extremely shocked. Although they hadn't mastered the true saint mystical ability, the battles of many true saint mystical abilities over the past few years had already made them clear what kind of existence a true saint mystical ability was. It made them understand what kind of terrifying consequences it would cause if 3 true saint mystical abilities appeared at the same time. Under such circumstances, they suddenly felt the treasure light produced by the eruption of more than 100 true saint mystical abilities at the same time. They instantly thought that the various worlds were going to be finished. However, they were false saints after all. Very soon, they knew that this was impossible. As false saints who also existed in the various worlds, it was impossible for those false saints with true saint mystical abilities to commit suicide. They couldn't really ignore the safety of the various worlds. Since that was the case, it was obvious that the appearance of these true saint mystical abilities definitely had a deeper mystery. There must be some kind of even more powerful divine power that suppressed the destruction of the various worlds, true saint. This term instantly appeared in the minds of almost all the false saints. No matter how they thought about it, only true saints could suppress the destruction of the various worlds caused by true saint mystical abilities. Thinking of this, the false saints instantly became agitated. In the blink of an eye, the false sages who could sense the changes in this part of the world each activated their world and began to head towards this battlefield at their fastest speed. A fake sage would never lack courage. If these true saint mystical abilities could destroy the various worlds, then it would be useless for them to hide. However, if the power of the true saint mystical abilities was suppressed, then they would naturally not be in danger when they got close to the true saint mystical abilities. Under such circumstances, it was easy to imagine what their choice would be. Among the many worlds there was a square-shaped world that looked like a flying sword. It was the fastest. It was the first to arrive outside the world that had been modified by the ancestor of primordial chaos and looked at the world from afar. The war that will determine the fate of the various worlds has finally erupted. The Genesis Saint looked at the world. The light of wisdom in his eyes flickered slightly. When the Rock Saint and the others heard this, they showed expressions of agreement. Compared to the false saints of other worlds, they had directly come into contact with Luo Fan and Hengouzi. They naturally knew what Hengouzi and the others were trying to do. With this as the starting point, it was obvious what the reason for the battle inside the world was and what the final outcome would be. The world had been modified by the true saints, so it was naturally not something that an ordinary world could compare to. Even if any false saints stared their eyes out, they would not be able to see through the barrier of the world and see the battle that was happening in the world. It was the same for the Genesis Saint and the others. What they could see now was, however, the layers of treasure light that were spreading out from the world were constantly changing. They could only see the profoundness of the treasure light that they could not understand surging crazily like explosions. Then, it disappeared without a trace in the blink of an eye. After this flying sword arrived, more and more heavens and earths came from all over, gradually forming an encirclement. They densely surrounded the world that was being used as a battlefield. Every part of these worlds had been refined and had all turned into the shape of various treasures. They were arranged here like hundreds of strange treasures that were densely packed and floating in the air. These worlds were also divided into 3 camps, just like the inside of the world. If they met each other normally, it would definitely be a fight to the death. However, at this moment, they were all gathered here. There was not a single false saint, and none of the worlds had the intention to start a war. All of the heavens and earth quietly floated in the air, quietly looking at the heavens and earth that were emitting layers of treasures. Not all the false saints could easily deduce that the battle that was happening inside the world would determine the fate of the various worlds like the Genesis Saint. However, all the false saints knew clearly that the battle that was happening in the world was extremely important. The impact would be extremely far-reaching. The methods of a true saint are indeed amazing. A false saint's sigh spread throughout the many worlds in this area. It was heard by all the false saints here. Hearing this, the Genesis Saint raised his brows, and a faint smile appeared on his face. However, he could roughly guess what this false saint was thinking. There are so many false saints who have grasped true saint abilities in this world. They are fighting and planning something that will definitely be earth-shattering. If we don't make preparations, the final outcome will probably be unpredictable, the false saint continued. I'm afraid the final outcome will be unpredictable, the false sage continued. Fellow Taoist Tongda, what do you think? A false saint asked indifferently. This false saint was the saint who had gathered all the saints to hold the meeting of the saints back then. As for the false saint who had spoken first, clearly, he was the false saint who was known as Saint Tongda. Seal, Saint Tongda said indifferently. Saint Tongda said calmly, they're still fighting and restraining each other. The best choice for us is to completely seal this world along with them so that they'll never be able to leave this world. Only then will we have a chance to control our own fate. Seal? Fellow Taoist Tongda, are you joking? Another saint said indifferently, Fellow Taoist, do you have the confidence to seal this world that contains the means of a true saint? Since I dared to make this suggestion, I naturally have the confidence. Saint Tongda said, I'd like to hear the details. The voice of a false sage who sounded like an old man spread throughout the world, and was heard by many false sages. Following this, many false saints stopped speaking. Clearly, regardless of whether they agreed or disagreed with the seal, they all wanted to hear what Saint Tongda had to say. I have a true saint-level sealing formation that can serve as the seal, Saint Tongda said. A true sage-level array formation? These words made many false sages in many worlds gasp in astonishment. Impossible! If you have a true saint-level formation, how can your world still be like this? It should have grown more than 10 times, a false saint said directly. Chapter 1509. A true saint-level array formation is even more profound than a true sage's mystique. To successfully set it up, it would require at least 300 false sages to work together. There are only 13 sages in this world, but it's far from enough, Sage Tongda said calmly. Hearing this, many false sages came to a realization. They believed that he really had a true saint-level array formation. At this moment, the Genesis sage's eyes flickered slightly. He was extremely tempted by a true saint-level array formation and wanted to take a look at its profoundness. However, he was not interested in using a true saint-level array formation to seal the world in front of him. He had obtained the 2 true sage mystiques from the battle between Luo Fan and Hun Guzi for countless trillions of years. In fact, he had already relied on the comprehension of these trillions of years to allow the 19 false sages in this world to work together to cast a mystique that had a trace of the characteristics of a true sage mystique. His understanding of true sage mystiques was far deeper than the other false sages who had only seen true sage mystiques from afar. Those true sage mystiques might think that a true saint-level array formation was enough to completely seal the world and make the many false sages who had mastered true sage mystiques unable to break through. However, only they knew the hidden dangers. The power of a true sage mystique was a mystique that surpassed the limits of understanding of all false sages. How could such a mystique be sealed so easily? Even if the same true sage mystiques were to face them, they would probably be entangled forever. Could this true saint-level array formation really work against hundreds of true sage mystiques? This conclusion, no matter how he thought about it, it was unreliable. After thinking about this, the Genesis sage and the other false sages controlled the flying sword-like world and began to slowly retreat. At the same time, among the surrounding worlds, 60 to 70% of them made the same choice as the Genesis sage and the others. They also slowly retreated, and in the blink of an eye, the originally chaotic encirclement was divided into 2 layers. Among them, the inner layer was surrounded by hundreds of worlds, and there seemed to be some kind of invisible will communicating with each other. The outer layer was all that was left of the world. However, they floated there quietly, faintly giving off a feeling of coldness. They were all false sages. Which one of them was simple-minded? Needless to say, all the fake sages knew each other /s choice. Saint Tongda did not encourage them, nor did he reprimand them. Instead, he sent out his will to the heavens and earth that were not too far away. I need 300 fellow Taoists. There are 1,000 fellow Taoists here, which is a lot of people. Next, I will impart the true sage grade array formation to all of you. I hope that all of you can make your own decisions after studying it. False saint-level existences were naturally not like mortals or ordinary cultivators. When they encountered a large number of people and could not decide, they would have to compete first and fight first before deciding. After all, to false saint-level existences, if they were to truly fight, it would be an eternity, perhaps even tens of thousands of years. In fact, it would take hundreds of millions of years for a result to appear. After Saint Tongde finished speaking, he did not stop and immediately transmitted countless messages to the many heavens and earths through his will. A true sage-level array was naturally complicated beyond imagination and profound beyond imagination. However, for some reason that the pseudo-sage could not understand, the information on this true sage-level array formation was recorded, but it was extremely short, at the very least, compared to the profundities contained within it. It was extremely short. For example, this true sage-level array formation only had less than 10,000 words, including the name. Such short words contained a will, so it was naturally not a problem for the many false sages. In the blink of an eye, the many false sages in the inner circle had already completely memorized this true sage-level array formation. Heaven-sealing array. In an instant, these 3 words appeared in the hearts of all the false sages who received this will. This was the name of the true sage-level array formation. Even false sages found it difficult to understand the profoundness of this array formation. Its name was actually so simple, without any wonder at all. After Saint Tongde transmitted the method of setting up the array formation, he did not speak anymore and waited quietly. At this moment, the time in the hundreds of worlds in the inner circle began to accelerate crazily. In the blink of an eye, it had already accelerated to an unimaginable level. Almost in the blink of an eye, tens of thousands of years had passed in those worlds. Under this acceleration of time, more than half a day had passed. Only then did those worlds gradually recover, and the flow of time gradually slowed down, gradually returning to the original flow of time that matched the time dimension of the Earth's universe. If one really looked at the time that these worlds had experienced, billions or even tens of billions of years had probably passed. At this moment, Saint Tongde said, "I wonder if everyone has made up their minds?" Previously, the many false sages had accelerated the flow of time in their respective world. Obviously, they were comprehending the profoundness of the true sage-level array formation. Now that they had returned the flow of time to normal, it was obvious that their comprehension had already come to an end. Either they had comprehended the key, or they had already given up. This array formation is too profound. "I can't set it up," one of the sages said directly. As he said that, a world directly left the outer circle from the inner circle and merged with the many worlds in the outer circle that were looking at them coldly. As this world opened its mouth, similar words came from the other worlds one after another. Then they each left. In the end, there were exactly 300 false sages left here. There were a total of 50 worlds here. These were obviously the false sages who had agreed to help set up the array formation. This was not a coincidence, but a tacit understanding between the many false sages. As false sages, their dignity naturally would not allow them to set up the array formation when they were clearly unwilling. However, they deliberately said that they wanted to set up the array formation to cheat the true sage-level array formation. At least, this true sage mystical ability was not enough to make them disregard their dignity, since they were willing to stay where they were previously and not leave. This had already shown that they had such intentions. Under such circumstances, after receiving the array formation, they naturally considered their own abilities and the manpower needed to set up the array formation. Those who retreated from the inner circle at this time and said that they were unable to set up the array formation were either really powerless, or they did not have the confidence to do so. Either that or they felt that there were enough people and they were not needed. That was why the false sages who were suitable to set up the array were left there. Saint Tongde was not surprised by the situation in front of him. In fact, he did not even feel much surprise. All of this was within his expectations, seeing that the distribution had been done. He directly transmitted his thoughts to the 300 false sages, allowing them to know what he meant at the same time. After all, Saint Tongde had obtained this true sage-level array formation for a longer period of time and had the deepest understanding of it. Naturally, it was also Saint Tongda. Under such circumstances, it was naturally most appropriate for Saint Tongda to command and distribute their respective tasks. As their respective tasks were assigned, the 300 pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures instantly rushed out from those worlds and began to envelop the world that was emitting layers of treasure light that had the charm of a true sage. The complexity and mystery of a true sage level array formation were indescribable. Even the process of setting up the array formation already contained endless principles. There was a faint hint of the charm of a true sage. At this moment, the eyes of the many false sages in the outer circle lit up at the same time. This was especially so for the many false sages who had received the true sage level array formation previously. They combined the swimming trajectories of the many pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures with what they had previously comprehended. Combining the mysteries of that array formation, they vaguely had a better understanding of that true sage level array formation. Anything that was related to a true divine, whether it was a formation or a divine ability, or even an aura, would not be simple. It would definitely contain endless mysteries. They definitely had value that was enough for the false sages to dig deeper. Even though they had personally comprehended that array formation for hundreds of millions of years and had seen the process of setting up the array formation with their own eyes, they still felt that there were many mysteries that they had never comprehended before. In fact, it was not just them. Even the false sages who were controlling the pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures to set up the array formation also felt that when these pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures swam in accordance with the array formation, there seemed to be some mysteries that exceeded their understanding and imagination that naturally controlled those pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures, causing the process of those pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures to display some mysteries that exceeded their imagination. This made them feel that their understanding of the true sage level array formation was becoming deeper and deeper. At this moment, they suddenly rejoiced that they had stayed behind. Not to mention anything else, just the process of setting up the array was enough to make up for the effort they had put in during this period of time. The 300 pseudo-primordial epic spirit treasures began to constantly wander around that world. Each pseudo-primordial epic spirit treasure's trajectory was completely different from the others. These 300 trajectories were like 300 different kinds of inexplicable great Daos constantly evolving around that world, mysterious beyond mystery, wondrous beyond wonder. At this moment, the layers of treasure light that were emitted from that world seemed to have been stimulated by something. The originally invisible light that was harmless to any world and any living beings suddenly seemed to have turned into a substance. It actually formed some kind of resistance that specifically targeted those pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures. However, it vaguely caused those pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures to suffer an indescribable obstruction in the process, causing their originally smooth trajectory to become a little stagnant. This kind of stagnation was like a terrifying attack that directly affected the false sages, instantly causing the hearts of the false sages in the many worlds to freeze. They vaguely felt some kind of inexplicable danger shrouding them, as expected of the true sage mystique. At this moment, similar thoughts flashed through the minds of many false sages. The layers of treasure light that emitted the charm of the true sage came from the true sage mystique. This was something that all the false sages knew. They had only just started setting up the array, but the treasure light had already reacted. This revealed the power of the true sage mystique. It couldn't be more obvious, and they couldn't help but exclaim in admiration. Amidst their admiration, they were even more determined to activate their respective pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures to set up the array. The power of this true sage mystique was so powerful. It was so terrifying. If they didn't seal and control those false sages who could use this kind of mystique, wouldn't they become fish on the chopping block when they were free? Although the content of the true sage level array formation was less than 10,000 words, it didn't mean that it was easy to set up. However, that didn't mean that it was easy to set up this array formation. In fact, to set up this array formation, more than 300 false sages were required to work at the same time. Moreover, if the things that each false sage needed to do were to be described in words, it might even require tens of billions of words to barely be described clearly, a true sage-level array formation. It was that complicated. If not for the resistance of the layers of treasure light, it might take a few days to complete this entire task and completely set up the array formation. Now that the treasure light was getting stronger and stronger, the resistance of the array formation was getting stronger and stronger. The speed of setting up the array formation would only get slower and slower, and the time it would take would not necessarily be that long. If this goes on, it'll be a little dangerous. Perhaps the battle in that world will already come to an end before the array formation is set up. Almost all the false sages present instantly understood the current situation. For a moment, regardless of whether it was the false sages who participated in setting up the array or not, their expressions turned cold. The false sages who participated in setting up the array had cold expressions because this matter was directly related to them. There was no need to say anything else. As for the false sages who did not participate in setting up the array, their expressions were cold. The reason was even simpler. Although they did not participate in setting up the array formation, it was not because they were not wary of the many false sages in that world. It was just that they felt that setting up a formation wouldn't have any effect. At this time, seeing the situation gradually tilting towards the direction they were worried about, how could they not care? While more than 300 false sages were setting up the formation outside the world, the appearance of the entire world, that had been transformed by the venerable primordial chaos ancestor, had completely changed. The continents, the starry sky, and the oceans that originally existed in this world. It had completely disappeared. Instead, it was replaced by various spiritual lights that were emitted by the terrifying true sage theurgy. All kinds of treasure lights, all kinds of heaven and earth, all kinds of images. The Grand Mist ancestor hadn't strengthened the heavens and earth much in the past. How could the mainland's strength, the starry sky's strength, and the sky's strength compare to a true saint's? The aftermath of the battle between any two true divine gods' divine powers, as long as a trace of it leaked out, was enough to destroy everything in this world. Moreover, there were hundreds of true divine gods' divine powers battling in this world. That's right, there were hundreds of true divine gods' divine powers that were battling. Although there were only about 80 false sages standing in the two camps, if each false sage released a true divine god's divine power, the number of true divine god's divine powers would add up to about 80. However, don't forget that this was a war between the two camps. It wasn't a fair bet. How could they really strictly abide by the rules of fighting each other in pairs? It could be said that almost every false sage was attacking 7 to 8 other false sages from the other camp at the same time. At the same time, they were also enduring the attacks of 7 to 8 false sages from the other camp. In other words, each false sage released at least 7 to 8 true divine gods' divine powers. Under such circumstances, wouldn't the number of true saint divine abilities that were currently fighting in this world be at least a few hundred? With such a large number of true divine gods' divine powers piled up in this world, no matter how vast this world was, it should have long affected each other. In the blink of an eye, this world was completely torn apart and everything in this world was completely destroyed. However, it was clear that this world was no longer an ordinary world after the Grand Mist ancestor's transformation. The relationship between the countless true divine remarkable powers was independent of each other. The battle between any two true divine remarkable powers would not be affected. However, if a third true divine remarkable power joined in, the interaction between the 3 true divine remarkable powers would be offset. In other words, if the 3 true divine theurgies were to engage in a chaotic battle, the battle between any 2 true divine theurgies would not be affected. However, they would no longer be an external force for the other two true divine theurgies. This forcefully broke the vicious cycle that would have been created when the three true divine remarkable powers appeared at the same time. The changes were subtle and inexplicable, mysterious and unfathomable. However, even a false saint would only feel shocked when he thought about it, without feeling anything else. It was the same for three true saint theurgies, 4, 5, or even hundreds of true saint theurgies. It was also because of this that heaven and earth did not collapse and perish under the ravages of the hundreds of true divine mystical powers. However, none of the false saints cared about the existence of this world. All they cared about now, they were their own opponents. Especially Luo Fan. Perhaps it was because he had been in the limelight too much previously, or perhaps it was because the others were surprised that he had a disciple who was not a saint. A false saint without any background did not have any scruples. Therefore, during the beginning of the war, he was constantly being besieged by more than 20 false saints. More than 20 false saints. This was more than half of all the false saints in the opposing camp. Among the false saints who were besieging him, the most proactive one was obviously Jean Chanzi. He did not just launch one true divine theurgy to attack him. Instead, he launched 3 completely different true divine theurgies that targeted all directions to attack Luo Fan at the same time. He looked like he wanted to kill him. Is there a need for that? Luo Fan was rather depressed at this moment. His words were not only directed at the other 20 false saints who were besieging him, but also at Jean Chanzi. For example, Hun Guzi and the others were only besieged by 7 or 8 false saints at most. Although it looked rather difficult, it was at least at the general level. As for him, he only displayed a little ability that they did not have. It was just that he did not have a backer. He was already besieged by half of the people on the opposite side. How could he not be depressed? As for Jean Chanzi, although it was a little unethical for him to participate in this war, this was not his decision alone. How could he place all the blame on him? Now, not only were the 3 true divine gods greeting him, they did not even care about the other false saint. They were completely different from the others. Instead, she was only focused on attacking him. How could he feel good about this? Of course, although he was depressed. However, Luo Fan obviously would not say such words out loud. At this moment, he was expressionless as he controlled the 20 karma webs to fly everywhere in the world, entangling with the 20 true divine theurgies. The true divine theurgies had different magical uses and different emphasis. That was for sure. However, it was actually only meaningful to the true divine. For the false saints, their control over the true divine theurgies was in a state where they could only release them but not retract them. After the true divine theurgies were released, they could only rely on the instincts of the true divine theurgies to fight. In this way, they could only use the most basic power of the true divine theurgies. As for the deeper emphasis and magical uses, they were naturally unable to activate it. This resulted in a result. In the hands of the false saints, no matter what kind of true divine theurgies they used, they could resist any other true divine theurgies. Just like Luo Fan at this moment, the 20 true divine theurgies that were attacking him were all different. Their performance was completely opposite and contradictory, but he could easily deal with them with the karma webs. Therefore, at this moment, there were more than 20 karma webs floating around him, constantly entangling with the various true divine theurgies, and constantly evolving in more than 20 directions in the battle. If it was in the outside world, the true divine theurgies would interfere with each other. The person who released the true divine theurgies would be full of worries and naturally wouldn't fight again before the outcome of the 2 true divine theurgies was revealed. In that case, their battle would be to directly release the true divine theurgies and wait. However, they didn't need too much control and could do it easily. However, it was obviously not the same here. This was because the mechanism of the true divine theurgies interfering with each other had been suppressed. All the false saints didn't need to have any worries. After they released the true divine theurgies, they could completely adjust their own methods according to the battle situation between them and other true divine theurgies. When necessary, they could even release another true divine theurgies to suppress and destroy the opponent. In this way, their ability to control the true divine theurgies in this world was naturally many times stronger than in the outside world. Chapter 15:10. The evolution of those true sage mystiques was naturally all-encompassing, and the various mysteries within them were beyond the limits of what a false sage could understand. However, this did not mean that false sages could not affect the evolution of these true sage mystiques. After all, these true sage mystiques were released by these false sages. The power contained in them was the power of the false sages after all. Even if they could not completely control their changes, they could still slightly affect the direction of their evolution. Of course, this kind of influence might be better, but it might also be worse. Perhaps because of their influence, this true sage mystique gradually gained the upper hand in the battle against its opponent and gradually surpassed the evolution of another true sage mystique, thus obtaining victory. However, at the same time, it was more likely that it would affect the integrity of the original evolution of the true sage mystique. On the contrary, the direction of the evolution of the true sage mystique was not as good as their own evolution. Instead, it would drag down its power and cause it to be at a disadvantage in the battle. Of course, it was a true sage mystique after all, so the false sages did not have much of an impact on it. Regardless of whether it was a good or bad impact, it could not change much in the end. It was impossible to see the results so quickly. They had to wait for days and nights to accumulate before they could finally magnify these two changes to a level that could affect the outcome. This was also the role of many false sages in the battle between true sage mystique. All the false sages knew this very well, so they were all very clear about how great the advantage of the true sage mystique puppet, which was already considered super powerful compared to them, was. Therefore, they focused more of their attention on Luo Fan during the battle. That was why there were so many false sages besieging Luo Fan. Although Luo Fan was depressed in the face of these attacks, he was not discouraged at all. He affected his karma net more flexibly than the other false sages, making the karma net appear more flexible than the true sage mystiques of other false sages in battle. They kept changing in the void, and endless light and shadows were emitted from their bodies. Under Luo Fan's control, the intense treasure light vaguely formed a strange domain. The more than 20 pseudo-sage mystical abilities that were targeting him were all exhausted in this domain. Every mystical ability was for the sake of defense. At first glance, the pseudo-sage mystical abilities that were targeting him were all exhausted. It was not Luo Fan who was being besieged by more than 20 pseudo-saints. Instead, it was as if Luo Fan was besieging these 20 pseudo-sage cultivators. Although the net of karma was a true divine ability that targeted karma, the profoundness of it contained the profoundness of all false divine abilities. If those true divine abilities could unleash their true profoundness, they might be able to target the net of karma, a domain that could surpass the net of karma. But at this moment, it was obviously impossible. Besieging him is indeed the right choice, one of the false saints who besieged Luo Fan thought. The true sage sacred art that he executed looked like a pair of scissors. This pair of scissors had a famous name. It was called the Golden Flood Dragon Scissors. Normally speaking, it was the nemesis of all net-type magical abilities and net-type magical treasures. However, at this moment, this pair of Golden Flood Dragon Scissors was entangled by the net of karma. It became more and more difficult for it to move under the net of karma. The mysterious light that emanated from it, which could cut through everything, was devoured bit by the net of karma, forming many wonderful worlds. All sorts of grand and vast battles took place, and they were gradually annihilated within. The two of them were not the nemesis of each other at all. Instead, they were in a stalemate. It was not that a true divine ability like the Golden Flood Dragon Scissors was not enough, but that the false sage was not enough. The same situation appeared in almost every corner of this world. The majority of the true divine abilities countered each other. However, which of them had the upper hand in the end, and which of them was at a disadvantage, did not depend on the mutual restraint between the sacred arts. Instead, it depended on the false sage's guidance of those sacred arts and the changes in those sacred arts. Looks like this battle will probably last for a long time. A pseudo-saint sighed in the unseen world. Isn't this good? Jing Yitzi, who was also here, smiled at this moment. It's rare to see such a good show. If we miss it this time, we don't know when we'll be able to see it again. Hearing Jing Yitzi's words, the false sage could not help but smile bitterly. They were also false sages and disciples of sages, but these false sages did not forcefully suppress their emotions like the other false sages outside. They forcefully maintained the appearance that everything was under their control, that their intelligence could understand everything, and that they could understand everything. On the contrary, they did not hold back much of their emotions, especially at this moment when they were watching a good show. Only you can find this kind of thing interesting, the false sage said after sighing. Isn't it interesting? With so many true divine abilities constantly fighting, how many true divine mysteries are displayed? If we can comprehend one or two of them, the possibility of us turning false into reality will greatly increase, Jing Yitzi said with a smile. You can say such words to those inexperienced rogue cultivators, but you're talking to the wrong person, another false sage said. That's right. All of us have mastered true divine abilities. If we can comprehend the mysteries of true divine abilities, is there any more convenient condition than this? Since the true divine abilities that we've mastered are not enough for us to comprehend the mysteries, is it useful to witness the battle between these true divine abilities? Another false sage said. At this moment, the expressions of all the false sages changed slightly. One of them said with a faint smile, I didn't expect there to be a true divine level array formation. It seems like they're very determined. Why bother about them? This world was modified by Uncle Master Primordial Chaos. The true divine level array formation that the false sages cast can't affect this world at all. They're destined to do nothing, another false sage said. However, he was completely disdainful of everything that was happening outside the world. We have to teach them a lesson. Otherwise, they'll think that we're easy to bully. Jing Yitzi laughed at this moment. The other false sages heard this. They glanced at each other and shook their heads. They thought to themselves, the rumors are indeed true. Jing Yitzi is indeed a sh*t stirrer who wishes to stir up trouble. However, although they thought this way, they naturally wouldn't say it out loud. They just maintained their silence. Jing Yitzi didn't have any intention of asking for the others' opinions. What he said previously was just what he really thought. Since he had already said it, he naturally wouldn't stand on ceremony. He immediately raised his hand and pointed. A true divine ability that emitted a strong true divine aura appeared in his hand. In a flash, it had already rushed out of this world that was treated as a battlefield. At this moment, outside this world, the 300 pseudo-primordial chaos spiritual treasures had already circled this world countless times. Vaguely, the power that they left behind had already outlined a more and more complete formation. It became more and more complicated and mysterious, gradually emitting an increasingly intense aura. The aura that belonged to a true divine. At this moment, the true divine ability that looked like a sharp blade rushed out from the world and violently collided with the formation outlined by the 300 pseudo-primordial chaos spiritual treasures. An earth-shattering shockwave radiated from the formation and began to spread into the nothingness. It was unknown how far away it was. The formation instantly began to shake crazily. All the traces and powers seemed to have come alive in an instant, and they began to produce endless changes that completely surpassed the control of the 300 pseudo-sages. Layers of treasure light were instantly emitted from the array and combined with the tremors. However, it produced a strange effect, causing the hearts of all the pseudo-sages in this location to tremble. They felt as if their souls were being strongly impacted. Oh no! The false sages inside actually have the time to react to this formation. In an instant, similar thoughts appeared in all the false sages' minds. Saint Tongda's expression changed drastically at this moment. He shouted softly, and the pseudo-primordial chaos spiritual treasure that belonged to him suddenly trembled violently at this moment. The speed at which it swam around the world suddenly increased. At the same time, the other 299 false sages also tried their best to speed up their pseudo-primordial chaos spiritual treasures. Obviously, they knew that Saint Tongda wanted to complete this formation as soon as possible. They also agreed with this idea. As they sped up the formation, the vibration caused by the impact on the formation became more and more intense and obvious. The treasure light emitted by the formation also became more and more intense, and the aura that belonged to the true divine within it also became more and more obvious. After the sharp blade-like ability came into contact with the true divine level formation, it naturally evolved. Endless spiritual light emitted from it and naturally evolved into a strange formation. It actually wrapped around the formation outside. The sharp blade was attacking the formation from the inside. If it was an ordinary thing, it would be impossible for the formation to wrap around the formation from the inside. However, it was obvious that whether it was the formation or the sharp blade, they were not ordinary existences. This kind of situation that overturned the inside and outside did not seem abrupt at all when it appeared in front of everyone at this moment, nor did it seem unnatural at all. It was as if the formation created by the sharp blade itself should be able to wrap the entire formation outside from the inside. After the formation formed by the spiritual light emitted by the sharp blade wrapped around the formation outside, it naturally evolved endless light and shadow, producing countless incredible attacks that directly bombarded the formation. Although the formation was not completely formed, it was still a true divine level formation after all. Facing such attacks, it was not much weaker. At this moment, it also evolved endless light and shadow, producing countless attacks and defenses to block the many attacks from the sharp blade formation. Gradually, it was annihilated together with the attacks, causing the outcome of the battle to not be decided immediately. The sharp blade was a true divine ability, but its changes were faster and more flexible than the true divine level formation. The moment the attack was offset, it naturally produced the next round of evolution and began to produce new spiritual light, new light and shadow, and new attacks. This time, these attacks finally surpassed the reaction of the true divine level formation and were directly transmitted to the 300 pseudo-primordial chaos spiritual treasures. Through the pseudo-primordial chaos spiritual treasures, the bodies of the 300 false sages that were set up in the formation exploded. Their bodies were instantly annihilated, not even a speck of dust or powder could be seen. Of course, such a change was not enough to wipe out these false sages. Almost without any time, these false sages walked out of the great Tao of the world they were in and appeared completely again. So powerful! This thought appeared in the hearts of the 300 sages. Although they already knew how terrifying a true sage's sacred powers were, they only realized it when they personally faced the true sage's sacred powers. They had still underestimated the power of the true divine ability. If they were not false sages, as long as the world was not destroyed, they would not die. The collision just now was enough to completely wipe them out, leaving no trace of them. After sighing with emotion, they worked even harder to activate their pseudo-primordial chaos spiritual treasures. This allowed their pseudo-primordial chaos spiritual treasures to continuously accelerate during this process. They worked hard to perfect the true divine level formation as much as possible. At this moment, all the distracting thoughts in their hearts had disappeared. All they could think about was how to make the true divine level formation take shape as soon as possible. For the opposing false sages, it was rare for them to be able to focus wholeheartedly on something and have all other distracting thoughts disappear. At this moment, their original potential was stimulated to the limit, causing the speed of the pseudo-primordial chaos spiritual treasures to increase by more than 10 times. The speed of the pseudo-primordial chaos spiritual treasures increased by more than 10 times. Obviously, the completion speed of the formation had also increased by more than 10 times. Its power was naturally greatly enhanced as it was completed. Very soon, the true divine level formation once again evolved. Endless light and shadows were born, directly facing the countless light and shadows emitted by the sharp blade. In the fierce and jealous impact, countless changes were born, and the light and shadows were gradually annihilated. The next development was almost a repeat of this process. Although the evolution speed of the true divine ability was a step faster than the true divine level formation and had the upper hand in the battle, however, the true divine level formation was, after all, based on 300 pseudo-primordial chaos spiritual treasures. Its own power and endurance were extremely powerful. In the impact of the true divine ability, it was able to support itself well. Although it looked rather pathetic every time, it was always able to withstand it in the end. It waited until the formation once again evolved all kinds of attacks and defenses to annihilate the true divine ability. As time passed, the true divine level formation became more and more complete, and its reaction speed also became faster and faster. In the end, a few days later, when the 300 pseudo-primordial chaos spiritual treasures drew the last 300 arcs and finally fixed themselves at a certain position that they needed, the true divine level formation suddenly trembled. In an instant, an infinitely intense treasure light that belonged to the true divine level exploded and swept out in all directions. Following that, an indescribably powerful sealing force directly pressed down on everything inside the formation. At this moment, the true divine ability that was originally in the form of a sharp blade instantly reversed the state of the formation. The formation once again enveloped the true divine ability that was in the form of a sharp blade. Moreover, the sealing force began to act on the sharp blade, causing the various lights and shadows that the sharp blade had originally evolved to suddenly collapse at this moment. The moment the formation was completed, its power actually increased by more than 100 times. At this moment, the 300 false sages felt that their pseudo-primordial chaos spiritual treasures seemed to have entered a strange state in an instant. It seemed to have broken free from their control, but it also seemed to be controlled by them in a more special and mysterious way. This feeling was so wonderful that it made them feel a little dazed and inexplicable at this moment. This is the true divine level formation. Similar thoughts appeared in the minds of many false sages. The change of the pseudo-primordial chaos spiritual treasures was not within their expectations. However, when they thought about it, they realized that this was the only way it could be considered normal. This true divine level formation should have this kind of mystery to begin with. Only then could it be called a true divine level formation. As a true divine level formation, after the formation was formed, it had already exceeded the limit that a false sage could control. In that case, the pseudo-primordial chaos spiritual treasures that had been set up in this true divine level formation would naturally be enhanced by the power of the true divine level formation. As a result, if they wanted to control these pseudo-primordial chaos spiritual treasures, they naturally had to go through the power of this formation. Of course, it was impossible for them to be able to control it as they pleased like before the formation was set up. However, they were the life treasures of the false sages after all. These false sages still had an extremely deep control over these treasures. The power of the true divine level formation could not completely cut off this connection. On the contrary, because of this connection, these false sages could perform an extremely limited control over this formation. It was precisely because of this that the many false sages felt this way about their pseudo-primordial chaos spiritual treasures. just as the true divine level formation was completely formed. The advantage between the sharp blade-like true divine ability and the formation was instantly equalized. No matter how the true divine ability evolved, the true divine level formation would naturally evolve at the same time. There was no time difference, and the speed between the two was exactly the same. There was no difference at all. This way, the battle between the two was countless times more exciting. For those who had set up the formation, it was also many times easier. The situation where their bodies would shake and be destroyed every once in a while no longer appeared. All the false sages naturally closed their eyes. Their bodies and minds gradually became closely connected with the formation, as if they had become a part of the formation and participated in every evolution of the formation. In a trance, they could clearly feel that their understanding of the true divine level formation seemed to have become deeper and deeper. Vaguely, they could feel that their bodies and their pseudo-primordial chaos spiritual treasures seemed to have undergone some subtle changes. An inexplicable connection was gradually established between the 300 false sages through the formation. In an instant, the mental barrier between the 300 false sages seemed to have gradually disappeared. The many false sages vaguely formed a huge consciousness. Each of their thoughts seemed to have become a part of this consciousness. When this consciousness first appeared, it was extremely blurry and weak. However, as time passed, as the battle between the true divine level formation and the true divine ability continued, the consciousness began to become clearer and clearer. In the end, a few days later, an inexplicable sigh was born out of nowhere. This sigh seemed to contain indescribable joy, indescribable disappointment, and even some kind of indescribable sorrow and pain. It was so complicated that it could not be described with words. This sigh did not come from a single false sage, but from the combined consciousness of the 300 false sages. After a few days of evolution, the consciousness had become so clear that it had a true intelligence that had nothing to do with any of the 300 false sages. I was born because of the heaven-sealing formation, so I shall be the heaven-sealing sage. The intelligence said after sighing. This sentence spread throughout the void of the universe without any hindrance. It spread throughout the heavens and beyond. As he said that, boundless spiritual light was emitted from the bodies of the over 300 sages. It pierced through their respective worlds, penetrated the void, and directly gathered outside the heaven-sealing formation. In the blink of an eye, it formed a strange human figure. This figure was neither male nor female. Its appearance was extremely ordinary, but it also seemed to be extremely beautiful. It floated in the void and naturally emitted an aura that was stronger than any other false sage. It was eternal and indestructible. In fact, there was even a hint of the aura of a true sage within the aura. It resonated with the treasure light emitted by the true sage level formation, and it was even more similar to the aura emitted by the true sage divine ability. It was a sage that seemed to be real yet not real. These changes caused the expressions of the many false sages in the outer circle to change drastically, and their eyes became filled with fear. How is this possible? At this moment, this was the only thought in their minds. The evolution of the situation in front of them had already exceeded their imagination, causing them to be at a loss for how to react. Among them, the false sages who had prepared to set up the heaven-sealing formation but did not join due to various reasons were even more afraid. They felt like they had escaped from death. Chapter 15:11. This unified consciousness was condensed from the consciousness of many false saints. In this way, those false saints had already become a part of this unified consciousness. Although they were still alive, their thoughts were already serving this unified consciousness and were no longer for themselves. It was no different from being dead. As for the fact that they would regain their autonomy and independence once this unified consciousness dissipated, that was indeed the truth. However, since this unified consciousness was already a false saint and had already obtained true intelligence, how could it possibly commit suicide and dissipate? That was, therefore, it could be said that from now on, the 300 false saints would no longer exist in this world. In the various worlds, there was only this heaven-sealing sage left. It was because of this that the many false saints were so afraid. If they had also participated in setting up the formation previously, they would be the ones who were no different from being dead now, and not the 300 false sages now, after the heaven-sealing sage took form. He looked around and suddenly smiled. He raised his hand and waved. In an instant, the several dozen areas where the 300 sages were seemed to have been grabbed by invisible hands, and they began to shoot towards where he was at high speed. As they shot out, they gradually shrank until they completely entered Saint Skysealer's hand. In the blink of an eye, they disappeared without a trace. It was obvious that the heaven-sealing sage had completely fused with his body and become a part of him. Seeing what he did, the surrounding false saints were even more shocked. This method of treating the world as an ordinary thing and easily controlling it as he pleased was tens of thousands of times stronger than what they could do. To be able to do this, it was enough to show that this heaven-sealing sage was much stronger than all of them. As pseudo-sages, they were already quite unwilling to have a true sage above their head. Now that the unified consciousness of many pseudo-sages had suddenly appeared and was much stronger than them, how could they accept this? "We can't stay here for long, in the world that looked like a flying sword," the Genesis sage said indifferently. As he spoke, he started to activate their world, which was that flying sword, together with the rock saint and the others. They started to head into the depths of the void. The reaction speed of the Genesis sage and the others was the fastest among the many false sages present. After the flying sword left, the other false saints seemed to have woken up from a dream. Each of them understood the danger here. They knew that if they continued to delay here, whether it was Saint Heaven Sealer or one of the false saints in the world, they would die if they were unhappy with them. How could they dare to delay here? They each began to move their own worlds and quickly left in different directions into the depths of the void. As for the matters here, they couldn't be bothered to care anymore. In the blink of an eye, this place, which was originally densely packed with hundreds of false sages, was now empty. Only the heaven-sealing sage, who looked neither male nor female, was left hovering in the void, as well as the existence of the heaven-sealing array that was wrapped in the heaven-sealing array. But in an extremely short period of time, earth-shattering changes had taken place. Saint Skyseal did not pay much attention to the departure of those worlds. He didn't even take a glance at them. At this moment, he was more focused on the heaven-sealing formation in front of him. He was focused on the true sage's ability that was like a sharp blade inside the heaven-sealing formation. To other false saints, the world that they were born in was their foundation. It was the reason why they could become false saints. However, to Saint Skyseal, the status of the heaven-sealing formation was the same as that world. It was also his foundation and the reason why he could become a false saint. Therefore, although Saint Skyseal was already a real false saint that was countless times stronger than ordinary false saints, he was no longer an illusory existence. However, it did not mean that he could really exist forever like a false saint. In fact, as long as the sky-sealing formation in front of him existed, it would always exist and maintain its power that surpassed ordinary false sages by countless times. However, if the heaven-sealing formation collapsed, he would be beaten back to his original form and his intelligence would instantly collapse. The 300 false saints would regain their independence, which meant that he would be divided into 300 bodies again. Since the heaven-sealing formation was so important, how could Saint Skyseal not think of a way to make use of his strengths and avoid his weaknesses? He floated quietly with a deep frown. He carefully observed the battle between the heaven-sealing formation and the sharp blade-like true sage's ability. After the heaven-sealing formation became complete, its power was many times stronger than before. At this moment, all the evolutions related to true sages were so fast and mysterious. After overcoming the initial resistance from the transformation, the speed of the transformation was even faintly increasing. Now, unknowingly, it had already surpassed the sharp blade-like true divine ability. It actually caused the true divine ability to be unable to react in time and gradually gained the upper hand. Of course, it was only gaining the upper hand. After all, it was facing the true sage's ability, an existence that contained some of the mysteries of true sages. The mysteries were unimaginably profound, so how could it be defeated so easily? Under the terrifying power of the heaven-sealing formation, the power of the true sage's ability began to gradually increase. Its potential gradually erupted, and its evolution speed also began to increase with great difficulty. However, it closely followed behind the evolution speed of the heaven-sealing formation and was not pulled away by the heaven-sealing formation. In fact, it slowly narrowed the difference in speed between the two. A true sage-level formation actually has such changes. No wonder Master never passed this kind of formation to us back then. In the world, Jing Yitzi lamented. He and the other sages in the unseen world had seen everything that had happened outside this world clearly. At this moment, everyone had a look of emotion on their faces. After a true sage-level formation was successfully set up, it would actually give birth to a unified consciousness and even devour all the false sages, causing them to lose their independence. This change was beyond the expectations of all the false sages. One had to know. These false sages were all disciples of sages. They had ways to obtain true sage mystical abilities and true sage-level array formations. However, all along, even when they begged the sage to teach them the true sage-level formation, their master rejected them. Initially, they were still doubtful and thought that the power of the true sage-level formation was too strong, and they might not be able to get rid of it even if it was set up successfully. However, they didn't expect that the true sage-level formation would actually have such a fatal weakness. This made them instantly realize something. A few of them who were originally determined to beg the sage to bestow the formation even started to feel fear at this moment. However, although there is such a weakness, after it is set up successfully, the power of this formation is really strong. It seems that we can finally see the state of the true sage's ability being destroyed, another false sage said with a smile. All of them were experienced and knowledgeable. At this moment, there were hundreds of true sages' abilities fighting inside the world. How could they not see the situation of the battle between the heaven-sealing formation and Jing Yitzi's true sage's ability? How could they not know that at this moment, Jing Yitzi's true sage's ability seemed to have a chance to catch up? However, that was just an illusion. The failure of the ability was already a matter of time. Isn't that great? I'm really looking forward to seeing what the true sage's ability will be like after it is destroyed. When Jing Yitzi heard that, she didn't seem depressed at all. Instead, she seemed to be looking forward to it. This kind of performance made the false sage, who originally wanted to watch Jing Yitzi make a fool of herself, feel a little bored. At this moment, another false sage said, "I'm afraid it will take many years before it reaches that ending. I'm afraid we'll have to wait." What's wrong with waiting for a while? Anyway, it will be shorter than the time they fight in this battlefield, right? Jing Yitzi laughed. This was the right thing to say. Although there were false sages constantly adjusting and controlling the battle between the hundreds of true sages' abilities inside the world, the difference between them wasn't considered big. They had to magnify the advantages and disadvantages of their respective adjustments to the point where they could determine the outcome. However, the time needed would definitely be quite long. In comparison, outside this world, the difference between the Seal Sky formation and the theurgy was many times greater than the difference between the two true divine theurgies. After it developed naturally, the Seal Sky formation would be much stronger. After the natural development, the effect of the difference would continue to be magnified until it reached the point where it could determine the outcome. The time needed would naturally be much less than the battle between the true sage abilities of similar abilities. The false sages only smiled and didn't say anything else. Under such circumstances, various true sage-level remarkable abilities and formations kept clashing inside and outside the world, erupting with countless tragic sounds. However, the many false sages inside and outside the world fell into silence. Be it Saint Skyseal, Jing Yitzi and the others, or even Luo Fan and the others who were fighting, none of them spoke. They were all waiting. They were waiting for the final outcome of the battle between their true sage abilities. Time passed slowly. In the blink of an eye, 10 years had passed. After 10 years of development, the outcome of the battle between the sky sealing formation and the sharp blade-like ability was gradually revealed. Just as Jing Yitzi and the others had expected, the sky sealing formation gradually gained an absolute advantage. At this moment, trillions of changes that were completely beyond the understanding of any false sage would appear in the sky sealing formation every second. Endless incredible changes kept appearing in the formation. All kinds of light shadows, all kinds of spiritual lights, all kinds of worlds, and all kinds of destruction were constantly circulating and changing at an unimaginable speed. In contrast, although the sharp blade-like true sage ability also had similar changes, it was obvious that it was already exhausted. From time to time, it would find it difficult to resist some of the changes that the formation had evolved. Those changes would directly attack the main body of the ability, causing it to suffer some kind of inexplicable damage. From the looks of it, it was obvious that after a period of time, the battle between the true sage ability and the sky sealing formation would come to an end. At this moment, Saint Skyseal's expression had already become serious. At the same time, Jing Yitzi and the others in the heaven and earth became solemn. What would happen if the true sage ability failed? They were all looking forward to this. Time passed minute by minute, and no one knew how much time had passed. All of a sudden, a certain change that had evolved from the sky sealing formation directly broke through the defense of the sharp blade and directly penetrated the core of the true sage ability. It suddenly shattered the mysteries of the true sage ability. As the mysteries that were originally completely untouchable and unshakable were shattered, the terrifying power that the true sage ability had accumulated over the years suddenly paused, and the countless changes that it had evolved also paused at the same time. With this pause, the power of the sky sealing formation was used on them without holding back. The incomparably intense treasure light began to sweep wildly in all directions at this moment. A terrifying roar spread throughout the heavens, and all living beings seemed to hear a terrifying thunder in their ears in an instant. The earth-shattering shock wave ignored the obstruction of the sky sealing formation and swept in all directions. In the blink of an eye, a huge number of worlds that had been pushed far away were swept away, and many of them were completely destroyed. Countless living beings died in an instant, causing the already empty area to become even more spacious. This is the time. At this moment, Saint Skyseal let out a soft roar. With this roar, he raised his hand and waved. He raised his hand and waved. In an instant, the heaven sealing formation spat out the heaven and earth as it shot toward the heaven sealing saint at high speed. In the world, many false sages instantly understood what Saint Skyseal was thinking and couldn't help but become serious. Not good. He wants to absorb the formation into himself and obtain true freedom. Letting Saint Skyseal obtain freedom originally had nothing to do with them. After all, Saint Skyseal had no grudges with them, and the previous battle was nothing to them. However, with the addition of the sky sealing formation, the situation would be completely different. The sky sealing formation was a powerful formation that could defeat a true sage's mystique in just 10 years. This kind of formation was a greater threat to the false sages under the sages than any of them. If they let him go, that would be even more troublesome than letting the false sages under the sages go free. If he wanted to, he could almost stop the decisions of the sages at any time. He could stop them from collecting pseudo-primordial chaos spiritual treasures, and he could even collect pseudo-primordial chaos spiritual treasures himself, going against their will obviously. No false sage under the sages would agree to such a thing. If they were willing, why did they go through so much trouble to let Jean Chanzi participate in the battle back then? They clearly didn't participate in the two camps, so why did they have to enter this battlefield? When he realized this, Jing Yizhi made a prompt decision. He instantly released another true sage's mystique and rushed out of this world, heading toward the true sage level sky sealing formation. 10 years ago, Saint Skyseal had already prepared to leave this world and regain his freedom when the sky sealing formation broke away from the battle and returned to his control. Just now, when the sky sealing formation spat out the formation, he quickly escaped and rushed toward his body at an unimaginable speed. Jing Yizhi's true sage's mystique was released in a hurry. How could that speed compare to the sky sealing formation? Under normal circumstances, this true sage's mystique would never be able to come into contact with the sky sealing formation. However, this world was no longer an ordinary world, but one that had been transformed by a true sage. Its profoundness was not something that a false sage could understand, and its magical effects were even more extraordinary. When the true sage's mystique rushed out of the world, in an instant the world flashed faintly. The true sage's mystique pierced through the void as if it was directly reversing time. It directly arrived in front of the sky sealing formation and instantly collided with it. As soon as the two collided, the sky sealing formation naturally displayed all kinds of incredible power and instantly broke free from the false sage's control. In other words, at this moment, Saint Skyseal lost control of the formation. The scene that had happened outside the world in the past 10 years appeared once again. However, this time, it didn't envelop the world. Instead, it was in a position that was slightly away from the world. The layers of treasured light once again spread out in all directions, although the true sage level formation had evolved to the point where it could crush a true sage's mystique that was like a sharp blade. After the true sage's mystique disappeared, the various changes that it had evolved to the limit gradually decreased. At this moment, this formation had gradually returned to the appearance of the formation that had just been set up. Compared to before, its power was already many times weaker. This was not as good as a true sage's mystique. For a true sage's mystique, it had already evolved. As long as the mystique could be retracted, the results of its evolution would already be engraved on that mystique and would never disappear. Compared to a formation, as long as the stimulation of the formation disappeared, all the mysteries that it had evolved would naturally disappear. It was obviously much stronger. This situation seemed ridiculous, but it was actually normal. A true sage's mystique was a mystique's foundation. It was only the power and mysteries that formed the true sage's mystique. As a result, it didn't have a fixed form, but it was extremely malleable. All of the changes in its evolution process were engraved in the power and profundities that made up its existence. Naturally, once it appeared, it would be destroyed. Naturally, once it appeared, it was already a part of this mystique and wouldn't change. However, it was different for a true sage level array. Although it also had the power of a true sage's mystique and the various changes of a true sage's mystique, its foundation, it was the thing that set up the formation. For the sealed sky formation in front of them, it was the 300 pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures. In this way, the various mysteries and changes that this formation evolved could only be created by changing the 300 pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures. Otherwise, it could only be created by external stimulation and wouldn't last long. Naturally, once it lost the external stimulation, it would naturally disappear and return to its original form. This was also natural. After all, a formation was different from a mystique. A formation was something that could exist for a long time. If its power was increased every time it went through a battle, Wouldn't it be able to unleash its power to the limit as long as it existed and fought with the true sage's mystique? In the end, it wouldn't need the true sage's control at all to perfectly unleash the power of a true sage. How was this possible? It was also because the formation had recovered its original power that although Jing Yixi had used a true sage's mystique that was shaped like a sharp blade, the sealed sky formation still didn't have the elegance of destroying the true sage's mystique in the end. Instead, it was entangled with the true sage's mystique and began to fight back and forth. It seemed like the sealed sky formation only had a slight upper hand in the battle. At this moment, Saint Skyseal's expression had already become extremely ugly. He had waited for this opportunity for 10 years. It seemed like he was about to succeed, but this sudden change that was beyond his control suddenly happened. One could imagine how frustrated he was. While Heaven's Sealing Sage was vexed, Jing Yixi and the others were dumbfounded. What happened just now? It seems like heaven and earth helped my mystique to block that formation? Jing Yixi asked another false sage. That's right. That's what I saw. That false sage frowned. But how is this possible? Why would heaven and earth interfere in the battle between false sages? Jing Yixi frowned. Suddenly, a fake saint revealed a look of realization and said with a smile, I see. I understand now. His words were like a switch that made more and more false sages suddenly come to a realization. This wasn't because there was something magical in the words of the false sage or the information it contained that allowed the false sages to comprehend something. Instead, it was because the minds of the false sages were similar. What the false sage could think of, the other false sages would probably be able to think of as well. Chapter 15:12. After this world was transformed, my divine sense shouldn't have been able to break through this world before the result of the battle was known. I shouldn't have been able to fight with Saint Skysizer outside of this world. However, I was able to do it without any hindrance. This is clearly a huge flaw. Why didn't I think of it after 10 years? Jing Yixi smiled bitterly. That's a huge flaw in my plan. This point seemed very contradictory and difficult to understand. However, if there was a premise, then everything could be explained. It was what was happening now. His true divine mystique actually broke through the void so easily and stood in front of the sealed sky formation. This was the explanation for why he was standing together with the sealed sky formation. The premise was that back then, when many false saints attacked this world and wanted to seal this world, it was equivalent to them getting involved in the internal battle between the factions of this world. In other words, from the beginning, the vicious cycle that existed in this world that prevented 3 true divine theurgies from appearing at the same time had already been used on the sky sealing formation. It was precisely because of this that the sealing sky array was intimately connected to the world. No matter where it was, as long as this connection couldn't be severed, this world would be able to transmit all theurgies and all powers to the surroundings of the sky sealing formation to fight with it. After understanding this, Jing Yixi felt more or less relaxed. If this was really the case, things would be simple. Not only could one false saint attack, but there could also be no more than one true divine theurgy to fight with Saint Tianjue at the same time. Instead, there could be many true divine theurgies to fight with the sky sealing formation. It could even be said that it didn't matter if they didn't care about the sky sealing formation anymore. Saint Tianjue didn't join any of the 3 camps in this world at this moment. This way, no matter which side won in this world, it had nothing to do with him. He would fall into the same fate as the loser. He would be directly sucked into this world and couldn't leave this world. Naturally, he wouldn't be able to destroy their decision. Of course, the premise of all of this was that Jing Yixi's idea was correct. The sky sealing formation had really become a part of this heaven and earth battlefield. Unfortunately, even though he knew that confirming this would save him a lot of trouble, it wasn't that easy to do so. Just like what happened previously, His true sage sacred powers could leave the heaven and earth and fight with the sealed sky array. His true sage sacred powers could penetrate the void and block the sealed sky array in the blink of an eye. Apart from this explanation, there were other explanations for all of this. Even if those explanations weren't as perfect as this one, there was still some possibility. Therefore, it could not be used as a basis to confirm that the heaven-sealing formation had indeed been incorporated into the battlefield within this world. There was only one way to confirm this point. That was to send another true divine mystic art over and let two true divine mystic arts attack the heaven-sealing array. If the heaven-sealing array and Jing Yixi's true divine sacred ability didn't form an irreversible vicious cycle, then it was completely confirmed. If it was a vicious cycle, then it obviously meant that there was another reason that caused all these flaws, but it was obvious that this was placing the entire universe on the gambling table. Even Jing Yixi couldn't make such a decision casually. After thinking about it, Jing Yixi suddenly revealed a faint smile. Almost all the false sages under the sages couldn't use their sacred powers to attack the heaven-sealing formation together with his true divine sacred powers. However, there was one person who was most suitable to do this. Think carefully. He smiled faintly and opened his mouth to speak. His voice directly penetrated the void and reached the extremely tragic battlefield, entering the ears of one of them. Taoist Luo Fan, there's one thing that I have to do for you. That's right, the direction in which his voice was transmitted was where Luo Fan was. Luo Fan was currently being besieged by more than 20 true divine sacred powers and was extremely nervous. When he suddenly heard this voice, he was puzzled. So it's Taoist Jing Yixi. I'm a little busy now, so I'm afraid I can't help you. His voice was extremely calm. However, it didn't match the state that he was currently being besieged. After 10 years of development, the more than 20 karma webs that he had sent out had already evolved to a state that was almost completely different from before. Its power had also increased to an unbelievable level. At this moment, if he were to attack any fake saint with this god art, he could guarantee that the fake saint would definitely be instantly affected by the countless changes that the god art had already evolved. The infinite power would completely crush and wipe them out. Even if the false sage had the characteristics of being eternal and indestructible, it would still be the same. Since his karma webs had undergone such a change, the true divine sacred powers that besieged him would of course undergo a huge change as well. At this moment, it was also many times stronger than before. Even Luo Fan, in the face of any one of these spirit powers, felt that if he was careless and was attacked by it, he would definitely lose his life and withdraw from this battle. Under such a situation, he didn't have the mood to care about anything else at all. Hearing Luo Fan's reply, Jing Yixi wasn't surprised. She smiled and said, "This really has to be done by you. If you don't believe me, please take a look." As she spoke, a guidance was released from her body and transmitted into Luo Fan's ears through her voice, guiding him to look beyond the world. The world blocked power, but it didn't block perception. Very soon, Luo Fan saw the battle that was happening outside the world. He saw the heaven-sealing sage, the heaven-sealing formation, and Jing Yixi's sacred powers. Countless thoughts flashed through Luo Fan's mind. At first, he didn't figure out what was going on, but very soon, he noticed all sorts of suspicious points and suddenly understood many things. He couldn't help but frown. I didn't expect there to be someone who has mastered this true sage-level formation. It seems that I really have to test it out in order to determine if this formation has been included in the battlefield. The reason why Luo Fan could easily see through the suspicious points and flaws that Jing Yixi and the others couldn't see through for 10 years was not because of that. It wasn't because Luo Fan was much smarter than them. It was because Luo Fan had already obtained Jing Yixi's hint. He knew what the problem was. Thinking in this direction, he was naturally able to see the problem faster than Jing Yixi and the others, who didn't expect there to be a problem. after making a decision in his heart. Luo Fan didn't hesitate. Although he was dealing with the siege of those true sage sacred powers, he seemed a little exhausted. He seemed to be somewhat exhausted, but it didn't mean that he was completely unable to divert even a little bit of his attention to send out another magical ability, leaving some strength to deal with an unexpected situation. How could Luo Fan forget this kind of preparation that must be done in battle? If he couldn't even release another sacred power, what if another false sage attacked him with a true sage mystical ability? With a single thought, he lifted his hand, and a new net of karma shot out from his hand. It instantly pierced through the barrier of the world, and rushed out into the void outside. The moment the god art rushed out of the heaven and earth barrier, the heaven and earth faintly underwent the same kind of change that happened when Jing Yixi's god art was released. Subsequently, the net of karma had already pierced through the void and rushed into the sealed sky formation. *T. Saint Skyseal's eyes narrowed as he thought to himself. Although it was a unified consciousness and had only been born not too long ago, it did not mean that Saint Skysizer was willing to see the destruction of the entire universe. He was the collective consciousness formed by the combination of 300 false saints. The memories of the 300 false saints were his memories. Naturally, he knew what would happen if 3 true sage stage powers were to be used together. At this moment, he saw Luo Fan. The karma web crashed into the battlefield of the sealing sky array and the true sage's sacred powers. He was so shocked that he was speechless. He tried his best to change the direction of the sealing sky formation so that the sealing sky formation could avoid the karma web. Unfortunately, all his efforts were useless against the sealing sky formation. It was like an ant trying to shake a tree. There was no effect at all. The sealed sky formation was still fixed in the void, and it was still fighting with the true divine theurgy that was as sharp as a sharp blade without any regard for anything in the outside world. The battle was extremely fierce and mysterious. Saint Skyseal could only watch in despair as the karma web crashed into the sealing sky formation. At the same time, it erupted with boundless treasure light and began to fight the 2 true sages' sacred powers. It's over. The universe is gone. At this moment, this was the only thought in Saint Skyseal's mind. Indeed, that's the case. In contrast to Saint Skyseal's despair, Jing Yixi and the others heaved a sigh of relief. Their faces were filled with relief. Even Luo Fan heaved a sigh of relief. That was because it was obvious that although the 3 true sages' sacred powers attacked each other in pairs, they were still restricted by some strange mechanism. They established a vicious cycle, but they were still relatively independent of each other. When they fought, the scale did not expand infinitely. Instead, they were restricted to the range of the sealing sky formation. This situation was almost the same as the battle between Luo Fan and the other false saints in this world. There was no difference at all. The fact that this happened was enough to show that Jing Yixi and the others and Luo Fan's guesses were correct. Saint Skyseal was indeed restricted by the mechanism of this world that had been modified by the true sage. He was also treated as a part of the 3 camps in this world. After discovering this, Luo Fan no longer had the mood to care about the sealing sky formation. No matter what the sealing sky formation looked like, as long as it didn't make his efforts useless and make him suffer the attacks of the other 20 false sages, he couldn't be bothered to care about it. In an instant, he drew his senses away from the world and directly focused on the battle inside the world. How could this be? Saint Skyseal had already returned to his senses at this moment. He looked at the strange changes that were happening inside the sealing sky formation and couldn't help but feel confused. Everything that was happening in front of him had already exceeded his understanding. Could it be that the 3 true sage powers appearing at the same time won't completely destroy the world? That's how it is. Nothing will happen? In his confusion, he couldn't help but suspect that the 300 sages had his memories. However, He wasn't an ordinary cultivator after all. He didn't lack confidence. He quickly confirmed it. Those memories couldn't be wrong. The appearance of 3 true sage powers at the same time would definitely cause unimaginable consequences. After confirming this, he understood everything that was happening right now. There was only one possibility, and that was because of the world in front of him. After turning his attention to the world in front of him, he thought about it and knew that his guess was definitely right. After all, the battle that was happening inside the world at this moment was so tragic. There were so many true sage powers that appeared at the same time in the world, but they didn't destroy the world, nor did they destroy the world. This obviously meant that there was something special about the world. After understanding this, his expression didn't change, but bitterness flashed in his eyes. I'm also affected by the world now. Doesn't that mean that I'm also restricted by the world? I won't be able to be free anymore? As he thought this, his eyes became even more bitter. If other false sages were restricted like this, it wouldn't be a big deal. After all, to other false sages, true sage powers were just powers. No matter how powerful they were, if they were destroyed, they would only lose one of their powers. It wouldn't affect their actual bodies at all. However, Saint Skyseal was different. Saint Skyseal was formed from the unified consciousness formed by the 300 false sages after setting up the sealing sky formation. This heaven-sealing formation was equivalent to his heaven and earth, equivalent to his origin. If the sealing sky formation failed and was destroyed, it would be equivalent to his world and his source being destroyed. This was definitely fatal to a false sage. Being restricted here was equivalent to his body being completely fixed in this area, and he would be able to withstand more and more attacks from true sage powers. This meant that the possibility of the sealing sky formation being destroyed had increased to an almost inevitable level. In this way, it was only natural for Saint Skyseal to be so bitter. Although Luo Fan was no longer paying attention to this place, the karma net that he had sent out did not dissipate because of this. Instead, it began to evolve all kinds of powerful and strange powers according to the instincts of a true sage's power to fight against the sealing sky formation and the sharp blade. As a true sage-level power, be it the sealing sky formation itself, the karma net, or the existence that looked like a sharp blade, they all had unimaginable instincts and even intelligence. This instinct made the 3 god powers not simply inanimate objects. They didn't just charge around in battle, and they didn't just simply destroy. Instead, they were like a powerful army that knew how to defend, how to respond according to the situation, how to scheme, and how to unite. At this very moment, in the battlefield where the sealing sky formation and the 2 true saint divine abilities were fighting, the karma web and the sharp blade already knew that if they were to act on their own, they would definitely be destroyed by the sealing sky formation. Immediately they joined forces, energy flowed between them, and their power changed as they resisted the sealing sky formation together. As a result, the original situation of the 3 groups fighting against each other instantly changed, causing the pressure on the heaven sealing formation to increase rapidly. Faintly, it actually fell into a disadvantageous position. Of course, the karma net and the sharp blade weren't completely united true sage powers. The 2 of them were also calculating and guarding against each other. During the battle against the sealing sky formation, they would occasionally counterattack the other party, and from time to time, they would also find time to attack the flaws that the other party revealed during the battle. This scene was many times more complicated and exciting than the battle between the true sage and the sealing sky formation. This scene made the heaven-sealing saint extremely annoyed, but the mysterious Jing Yitzi was overjoyed. Jing Yitzi had always been a troublemaker who loved to stir up trouble. To him, as long as it was interesting and exciting, anything was fine. The battle between the 3 powers in front of him actually had the effect of the battle between the 3 kingdoms. To him, it was easy to imagine how exciting this was. It's a pity that if I use another power, although it won't be completely compatible with the original power, it will definitely be closer to the original power. That way, it won't be exciting enough. Jing Yizhi watched for a while, and suddenly said helplessly. He gradually felt that the battle between the three kingdoms was not satisfying enough, but he wanted to watch the battle between the four kingdoms. However, not all of the fake sages in the unseen world were like Jing Yizhi, who wished for the world to be in chaos. Although they felt that the battle between the three powers was interesting, they only felt that it was a little interesting. They didn't think that it was very exciting. Hearing Jing Yizhi's words, they all looked at him strangely. Jing Yizhi looked around and realized that everyone else had a disapproving look on their faces. He was disdainful. It's a pity that there aren't many like-minded people. At this moment, one of the fake saints said, "The battle between the four kingdoms. It seems quite interesting." As he said that, he raised his hand and pointed. Instantly, a small flag-like true sage power was created by his finger. It instantly penetrated the unseen world and broke through this world. Under the influence of the mechanism of heaven and earth, it penetrated through the void and crashed into the heaven-sealing formation, starting to fight with the other two true sage powers and a true saint-level formation. Jing Yizhi was originally a little disappointed, but when he suddenly realized that things had taken a turn, he couldn't help but be overjoyed. He smiled and said, "So it's not that there aren't any like-minded people." The fake saint who used the true sage power did not reply to Jing Yizhi's words. Instead, he quietly watched the battle between the four kingdoms that was taking shape inside the heaven-sealing formation. He was different from Jing Yizhi, but he wasn't a simple troublemaker. This time, he was only interested in the schemes and alliances between the true sage powers. He wasn't interested in interacting with Jing Yizhi. Jing Yizhi didn't get an answer. However, he didn't care and just watched the battle outside with great interest. While the battle between the four kingdoms was taking place at the location of the heaven-sealing formation, outside this world, the many worlds that had already been hidden in the depths of the void were using all sorts of special methods to watch the development of this area of nothingness. Although the fake saints had left this location, it was only to avoid trouble. It didn't mean that they weren't concerned about the development of the battle that might affect the fate of the various worlds. As for how they saw this place, it was even simpler. As a fake saint, which one of them wasn't a genius? Which one of them wasn't able to casually create countless mystical powers that would make all supreme venerables give up everything in exchange for them? How difficult would it be for them to see the various things here after leaving this place? At this moment, the many fake saints had already seen through the strangeness of the heaven-sealing formation. Vaguely, they had guessed many things and became even more fearful of that world. They had more guesses about the things that would be decided by the battle in that world. For a moment, all the fake saints felt like a storm was brewing. The battle between the four kingdoms soon took shape. With the addition of a true saint's mystical power, the situation of the battle was much more complicated than the battle between the three kingdoms previously. The layers of treasure light that were emitted from the heaven-sealing formation due to the battle between the true saints' mystical powers were more than 10 times stronger than before. The layers of endless treasure light radiated towards the depths of the void, and the area it affected became wider and wider. Finally, the treasure light spread to a seemingly ordinary major kiliacosm. The location of this major kiliacosm was somewhere in the depths of the void. Around this major kiliacosm, there wasn't a single world that could give birth to a sage. In fact, the density of the major kiliacosm was more than 10 times sparser than other areas. In the past, there had been many wars in the myriad heavens and realms, as well as many battles between the disciples of the sages using true sage divine abilities, and so on. However, none of the fluctuations, treasure lights, and auras had reached this level. This time, the treasure light produced by the battle between the four kingdoms had arrived. Since ancient times, the treasure light emitted by the true saint's mystical power had arrived here. This major kiliacosm was a world where the sky was round and the earth was square. However, its size was different from the ordinary major kiliacosm, which was boundless and had many medium kiliacosms, minor kiliacosms, and many spaces. Its size was only 1,000,000 miles in radius. It wasn't even as wide as a minor kiliacosm in the other major kiliacosms. Chapter 15:13. In this major kiliacosm, there was only one continent in the entire world. Even the distance between the heavens and the earth was only a few 100,000 feet. However, compared to other major kiliacosms, this major kiliacosm was many times stronger in terms of time stability and space stability. It was much stronger than those worlds that could give birth to false saints. If one were to compare it seriously, perhaps only the battlefield where Luo Fan and the others were fighting could be comparable to it. Apart from that, there was the Great Tao, but it was not the Great Tao of an ordinary major kiliacosm. Instead, it was a Great Tao that was even more magnificent and vast than the Great Tao of a world that could give birth to sages. The time, space, nomological laws, and even Great Tao in this world were not independent factors. Instead, they were combined in an extremely subtle and mysterious way to form an inseparable whole. All the powers within were communicating and circulating, and there was a faint charm of a cultivator cultivating. During this process, the entire world seemed to be constantly condensing and improving. There were quite a number of living beings in this world, but almost all of them were independent. In other words, there were very few living beings of the same species in this world, and it was even to the extent that there were even more of them that existed by themselves. It seemed to be so miraculous and strange at the same time. In a seemingly ordinary valley in this world, there was a thatched cottage. At first glance, the thatched cottage looked extremely ordinary. However, if one took a closer look, they would realize that every trace on it seemed to contain some kind of profound mystery that even surpassed what a false saint could comprehend. It was the mystery of the true saint level. The entire thatched cottage was placed there. It was as if the endless mysteries of a true saint were placed there. At this moment, outside this thatched cottage, there was an old farmer-like living being who was busy on the field in front of the thatched cottage. Of course, this living being only looked like an old farmer at first glance. As long as one took a closer look, they would discover that this living being was mysterious and mysterious. There were even traces of true saint aura being emitted from their bodies. The one who had said that was this old farmer. At this moment, the old farmer raised his head and looked at the layers of treasure light that descended from the sky out of nowhere. He seemed to be reminiscing. So many years have passed. It seems that the 7 true sages are already making their final preparations for the next great trial of heaven and earth. He looked at the sky and muttered, "This should be the 8th time. If we can't get through this tribulation cleanly, the entire world will probably shatter. When that happens, we won't have any more chances." He slowly stood up. In an instant, his attire changed. His expression and everything else did not change. However, his entire person seemed to have undergone an earth-shattering change from before. The aura of an old farmer had completely disappeared. What replaced it was a supreme aura that was even denser than that of a false sage. Eternal and indestructible, a temperament that could not be worn down by 10,000 tribulations. If they really wanted to compete, perhaps the current Heaven Bestower sage had some of his charm. However, it was only a few points. Compared to him, the Heaven Sealer saint seemed a little weak. There seemed to be some kind of indescribable flaw in his posture. After standing up, he said faintly, "Do you feel it too?" Hee. At this moment, a chuckle echoed in the world. This chuckle came for no reason, and there was no source for it at all. At this moment, even if any false sage was here, they would definitely not be able to find out where this voice came from. They would only feel that this voice was ringing in their ears. However, this obviously did not include the old farmer at this moment. The old farmer cast his gaze in a certain direction diagonally above. Light and shadow flowed in his eyes, and vaguely, he seemed to be able to pierce through the endless void, revealing an inconceivable barrier, and saw a strange scene. That was also a major kiliacosm. Similarly, it was not the performance of an ordinary major kiliacosm. Although it was not like this major kiliacosm, the sky was round and the earth was square. It was narrow and looked like a starry sky. However, its characteristics were similar to this world. Similarly, time was unimaginably stable, and space was indescribably stable. The great Tao in the unseen world was much stronger than the world that could give birth to saints. In the old farmer's eyes, the world continued to expand. In the end, in a certain corner of the world, the figure of a young man was enlarged, replacing the entire world. He appeared between the farmer's eyes and chuckled at him. The man's eyes also seemed to be able to penetrate the endless void, reflecting the old farmer's appearance. The man smiled and said, "How can you not feel this kind of thing? Only someone like you, who is isolated from the world, would only feel it at this moment." The old farmer frowned and said, "Could it be that you intend to participate? Why not? Didn't you guys also participate last time?" The man said with a smile, "It's because we participated last time that you should see the result of participating. There were so many fellow Taoists back then, but aren't there only a few of us left now? Could it be that you still haven't learned your lesson?" The old farmer frowned again. "Perhaps this kind of choice is wrong. But isn't this already the last chance? Don't you know what the result of this great calamity of the world will be? If the world shatters, our path of cultivation will be severed. From then on, we will never be able to turn false into true. Are you willing to see that result?" The man said plainly, "I believe that those true sages will have a way to avoid that result." The old farmer said, "Don't waste your breath. You and I know the flow of the river of fate very well. Although there are countless possibilities in the future, you and I should know that all possibilities will point to one result. That is, the patience of the world's will be exhausted. The world will be completely destroyed, and even true sages will have to leave this world. You and I, false sages, will return to the world. If we don't take this chance to fight and leave this world in the process, our final fate will be determined." The man said in disdain, "We are only from the perspective of a false sage. The future that we see is naturally not comprehensive. True sages will see more than us," the old farmer said unwaveringly. "Looks like we're on different paths again," the man said calmly. "I just hope you don't block my path. Otherwise, you and I have been friends for several eras. I'm afraid it's going to turn into a bubble. Ever since the last world calamity, I've known all of our actions and choices. None of them could escape the true saint's schemes. Therefore, there is no need for me to do anything. All of your actions will become the power of the true divine to change the river of fate. Don't worry." As the old farmer spoke, his body instantly reverted to his original appearance. He still looked like an old farmer. When the man heard this, he nodded. However, there was no fluctuation in his eyes. "That would be for the best," saying. The voice did not ring out again. When the voice stopped, another voice suddenly rang out in the void. "You've actually changed so much." This is the sound. It was the voice of a woman. His voice contained the same quality as the man's voice from before. They were both illusory and hard to find. Hearing this voice, the old farmer shuddered. He slowly raised his head. His eyes once again reflected a somewhat special great thousand world. Then, that great thousand world kept enlarging. In a certain location, the figure of a woman was reflected in his eyes. This woman didn't look very beautiful. At most, her appearance could be considered delicate and pretty. However, her entire body was filled with an indescribable elegance. Standing there, she naturally seemed to be the representative of the world's charm, causing people to involuntarily ignore her appearance and naturally fall head over heels for her. So many things have happened. Even existences like you and I cannot not change, the old farmer said. As he spoke, his appearance did not change like when he was talking to the man. Instead, he still maintained the appearance of an old farmer. Hearing this, the woman's expression did not change. However, there seemed to be a slight fluctuation in her eyes. After a long time, the woman sighed, "That matter cannot be blamed on you. Why are you so harsh on yourself?" "I'm not harsh on myself. Emotions like self-blame will not appear in people's hearts. It is also impossible for it to stay for so long. I just saw the path clearly and realized that I was wrong in the past," the old farmer sighed. "Is that so?" The woman calmly smiled. The light in her eyes clearly showed that she did not care. The old farmer did not explain much and said, "Looking at you, are you planning to participate in this calamity? You believe that true saints can change the river of fate, but I don't. If it wasn't for them doing as they pleased over the countless years, would the world have been tormented to this state? They would have long since broken through their shackles and become boundless. So, for this final chance I want to go all out and see if I can escape this world," the woman said. "Escape this world," the old farmer muttered. The woman calmly said, "Not long ago, a little fellow used some trick to escape this world. Even though there is still a tribulation, at least he controlled his own fate. If this matter does not succeed, perhaps I can use this method as a way out." The old farmer's eyes flashed. In an instant there seemed to be endless information flowing through his mind, allowing him to understand who knows how many things. He came to a realization and said, "Are you talking about the fuse that will cause this calamity? Even though that method seems to be breaking away from this world, how is it different from being in this world? It is just digging one's own grave." The two of them were clearly talking about how the Saint Sovereign used his own method to create a perfect world and then break out. Looking at their attitudes, it seemed that they did not think much of this method. One was completely disdainful, while the other treated it as a last resort. "At least this way he can control his own fate," the woman calmly said. "Control his own fate." The old farmer's expression was a bit dazed. There seemed to be a bit of leisure and nostalgia in his eyes. Right at this moment, another voice suddenly rang out, "You guys still haven't come to a conclusion?" This was also a woman's voice. When the old farmer heard this voice, his expression froze slightly as if he had never thought that this voice would appear here. His expression froze. He abruptly straightened his body, and the aura of eternal indestructibility that was even more profound than that of a heaven-sealing sage emerged from his body once again. The old farmer's appearance had completely disappeared in the blink of an eye. "You're actually not dead yet." He turned his head and his eyes seemed to pierce through endless obstacles to see a strange place. This place was not a great thousand world, but a medium thousand world. Compared to his great thousand world, this great thousand world was much smaller, and the light it emitted was much weaker. But inside that world, all of that was more powerful than his great thousand world. Whether it was the stability of time, the stability of space, or the layer of laws, or the hidden great Daos, they were all stronger than this great thousand world. "You've actually reached this step." The old farmer's eyebrows couldn't help but twitch when he saw that world. At this moment, the expression of the woman who was talking to the old farmer also became serious. She also revealed an even more obvious and powerful aura than the old farmer. Eternal and invincible. Invincible aura. "I've only gained a little, and I'm still far from truly cultivating it." "You're still far from it." The woman's voice rang out, and her voice was filled with emotion. It was a true indifference. The light and shadow in the old farmer's eyes changed again. The world quickly enlarged, and the figure of the person who spoke appeared in his eyes. It was a woman with a completely different style from the woman from before. The woman from before only looked delicate and pretty, but what truly made her infinitely charming was her temperament. However, this woman was completely different. Her appearance had already reached an extremely perfect state. No matter what aesthetic standards, no matter what living being, even if it was an existence whose aesthetic standards were the complete opposite of that of humans, when they saw her, they would only think of the word beautiful. The woman's expression was indifferent, and her eyes reflected endless light and shadow. She seemed to pierce through the endless void and see countless worlds and things, including the old farmer and the other woman. "How did you survive back then?" the old farmer asked word by word. "Hee." The woman suddenly laughed and said, "How did I survive? You won't understand even if I tell you, so what's the point of saying it? You clearly failed the last world calamity. You were clearly exiled into the chaos, so how could you return?" The other woman said the same at this moment. "Why do all of you want to ask questions that you can't possibly understand the answer to?" the woman said indifferently. Hearing this, the old farmer and the woman were speechless. They were all false saints, and they were existences that were many times stronger than ordinary false saints. How could they not know that if the other party didn't want to say something, she wouldn't say it no matter how they forced her? Moreover, they didn't have the strength to force her now. After a long while, the old farmer said, "What do you mean by contacting us this time? Could it be that you intend to get us to help you participate in this world calamity?" the old farmer asked after a long time. "I want to participate in the world calamity. I don't need any help from you," the woman said indifferently. "Then what do you mean?" the other woman frowned. "I'm just giving you a reminder," the woman said with a smile. "A reminder for what?" the old farmer asked in surprise. However, just as he asked this, he suddenly discovered that the dimensional realm he had locked onto, as well as the location of that woman, had completely disappeared from his senses. The scene in his eyes had completely lost the woman and the medium-class world at the same time. The other woman was experiencing the same thing as him, but she was also experiencing a similar change. Her eyes had also lost the woman's figure and the world. "As expected, she's much stronger than us," the woman sighed and said. "Indeed, she's much stronger than us. However, to be able to condense the world to this extent, it's normal for you to be able to do this, right?" The old farmer also sighed. After sighing, an inexplicable light flashed in his eyes. "However, even so, it's still impossible to survive in the chaos. What method did she use? Could it be that she can still return after being exiled into the chaos? Can she really do it without becoming a true saint?" Hearing this, the woman seemed to be taken aback and hurriedly said, "Don't tell me you want to try? It's best that you don't even think about it. Do you and I still have doubts about the limits of our abilities? If you can't do it, then you really can't do it." The old farmer just smiled and said, "Since I already know that someone has done it, how can I be satisfied if I don't give it a try?" As he spoke, an inexplicable fighting spirit flashed in his eyes. Such fighting spirit! It caused the old farmer's temperament to completely disappear from his body. It was impossible to find it again. Seeing this, the woman felt gratified. She felt helpless again. "Don't try to persuade me. Just like how you want to seize the last chance to fight, I also want to fight." The old farmer stopped the woman who was about to speak nonsense and said, "Since you've already made up your mind, what else can I say?" The woman sighed and didn't speak anymore. Somewhere in the myriad heavens and realms, such a conversation was taking place. In that battlefield, the war between the four countries between the sky-sealing formation and the other three true saint god powers had already become more and more intense. As they knew that this battle didn't affect the final outcome, be it Jing Yitzi or Luo Fan. Even the other false sage did not guide or control his true sage mystical ability. They just let the true saint god powers unleash their power on their own. Therefore, the three true saint god powers weren't united against the outside world. They weren't working together to target the sky-sealing formation. They just treated the sky-sealing formation as another very ordinary true saint-level power. During the battle, there were times when the Seal the Sky formation was about to be destroyed, and the three true divine sages added more power to the Seal the Sky formation. Among the three true divine sages, one of the true divine sages would automatically help the Seal the Sky formation and target the remaining two true divine sages. Be it the Karma Net, the sharp blade-like Shintong, or the small flag god power, they were all the same. Under such circumstances, one could imagine what the situation would be like in the war between the four countries. It was impossible for any one of them to completely suppress the other three. In fact, not a single one of them would naturally perish in the face of this attack. The entire situation seemed to be going on forever, until the end of the world or until any external force came to change them. This situation was naturally bad news for the Heaven Sealing Sage. He tried his best to guide and control his sky sealing formation, trying to break this delicate balance. Unfortunately, this was something that exceeded the limits of the Heaven Sealing Sage's abilities. Given the Heaven Sealing Sage's strength, his ability to guide the sky sealing formation was quite limited. The changes that the sky sealing formation could make were also quite limited. More importantly, the space that he could guide was too small. At this moment, the sky sealing formation was facing three true Saint God powers. These three true Saint God powers were completely its enemies. It had no companions at all. In this way, the Heaven Sealer Sage could only guide the true divine mystique of the sealing sky formation. He couldn't be like Jing Yitzi and the others, who could guide the true divine mystiques to target the sealing sky formation. In this way, how would it be of much use to change the situation? Therefore, even if the Heaven Sealing Sage stimulated his wisdom to the limit and pushed the thoughts of every false sage that formed him to the limit, he still couldn't change the situation in front of him. He couldn't break this balance that was going to last forever and end this battle. In this way there was a result. That was the layers of true Saint Treasure light emitted by the war between the four countries. As time passed, the range of the treasure light became wider and wider, enveloping more and more worlds that weren't originally enveloped by this treasure light.